It began with a promise that felt like salvation. In town squares across a nation still reeling from defeat and hunger, a single voice rose above the noise of empty factories and worried families, telling people they were not to blame for their pain. Someone else had taken what was theirs. Someone else was the reason children went to bed with empty stomachs and fathers walked the streets with nothing to do. All they had to do was listen, believe, and stand together. For many, that voice did not sound like the beginning of something terrible. It sounded like the first kind word they had heard in years. Hans was 23 when he first heard it. He had been a machinist in a small factory that made parts for trains, the kind of work that let a man stand a little straighter when he came home at night. Then the orders stopped. The machines went quiet. Hans spent his days walking from one closed gate to another, his boots wearing thin on the cobblestones. His mother stopped asking when he would find something. She simply set an extra plate at the table even when there was nothing to put on it. One evening, posters appeared on the walls near the market. They showed strong young men with determined faces, and the words promised work, pride, and a future that belonged to them again. Hans told himself he was only going to listen. He had nothing else to do. The square was already full when he arrived. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, some still in the worn coats of the unemployed, others in newer jackets that marked them as part of something organized. The air smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and the sharp scent of beer from the stalls at the edge. When the speaker climbed onto the platform, a hush fell that felt almost reverent. His voice carried without effort, rising and falling like a song the crowd already knew. He spoke of betrayal and renewal, of a people who had been humiliated for too long. Every sentence landed like a hand on the shoulder. Hans felt his chest tighten with something he had not felt since the factory closed, the sense that someone finally saw him. When the speech ended and the crowd roared, he roared with them. It was not anger that moved him. It was relief. He walked home slowly that night, the newspaper folded under his arm. His mother was waiting at the kitchen table, the lamp turned low. She asked where he had been. When he told her, she did not smile. She only said that hope was a dangerous thing when it came dressed in uniforms. Hans did not argue. He went to his room and read the paper by the light from the street. The words felt true. They explained why his hands had been idle and why the streets felt heavier every year. They gave him a place to put the ache he had been carrying alone. A few streets away, above a small clothing shop with a faded sign, the Goldstein family was finishing supper in near silence. Herr Goldstein had owned the shop for 18 years. He knew every bolt of fabric by touch and could tell a customer's mood before they spoke. Lately the bell above the door rang less often. People who used to stop and chat now hurried past, their eyes fixed on the pavement. Ruth, his wife, had begun to keep the front curtains drawn during the day. Their daughter Sarah, 12 years old and full of questions, had stopped asking why her friend from school no longer waited for her at the corner. She simply ate her bread and went to her room earlier than she used to. That night, after Sarah slept, Herr Goldstein unfolded a paper that had been pushed under the door while they ate. It was an official notice. Jewish shops were to display a certain mark. German citizens were encouraged to buy only from German hands. He read it once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. Ruth sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Neither of them spoke of leaving. The shop was their life. The apartment above it held every piece of furniture they had saved for. The cemetery on the hill held their parents. To walk away would be to leave the dead behind with strangers. So they stayed, and they told each other that things would settle, that people would remember who their neighbors really were. In a classroom 2 blocks from the square, Frau Schmidt stood at the blackboard while her students copied sentences from the new textbook. The sentences were simple and strong. They spoke of loyalty and strength and the importance of knowing who belonged and who did not. Most of the children wrote quickly, their pens scratching in unison. One boy, David, whose family ran the bakery on the corner, wrote more slowly. When Frau Schmidt walked between the desks, she saw that he had crossed out a line and started again. His essay spoke of fairness instead of strength. It mentioned helping the weak rather than punishing them. She placed the paper at the bottom of the pile without marking it. Later, when the children had gone, she sat at her desk and looked at the empty seat where another boy had sat until last month. No one had explained his absence. The headmaster had simply said the class list had changed. Frau Schmidt went home that evening and stood for a long time in front of her own bookshelf. She took down 2 volumes of stories her own children had loved when they were small and carried them to the attic. She told herself she would bring them down again when things felt safer. She did not know when that would be. These were not the moments that would later fill the newsreels. There were no marches yet with torches, no broken glass in the streets, no trains leaving in the night. There were only small, ordinary changes that arrived one at a time. A worker felt seen for the first time in years. A shopkeeper lost another regular customer. A teacher chose a safer lesson. A child stopped asking questions because the answers hurt too much. Each change by itself seemed too small to matter. Together they began to reshape the air people breathed. Hans kept going to the meetings. He liked the order, the feeling that every person had a place and a purpose. One evening he was asked to help keep the crowd from pressing too close to the platform. He stood with others in the same jacket, watching faces. Near the back he saw a man he recognized from the market, an older man who used to sell vegetables and always gave an extra apple to children who lingered. 2 men in uniform were speaking to him roughly, telling him to leave. The older man kept his eyes on the ground. Hans felt his stomach turn. He wanted to walk over, to say the man had done nothing wrong. But the men in uniform looked certain, and the crowd around them seemed to agree. Hans stayed where he was. Later, when he tried to sleep, he kept seeing the older man's face. He told himself the man must have broken some rule he did not know about. Everyone said the rules were there to protect people like him. The Goldstein family began to mark small mercies the way other families marked holidays. One afternoon, an older woman who had bought fabric from them for years came into the shop after closing time. She bought nothing. She simply stood near the counter and said, very quietly, that she was sorry for what was happening. She left a small wrapped package on the counter. Inside was bread and a note that said only, "For Sarah." Ruth cried after the woman left. It was the first time in weeks that anyone from outside their own walls had spoken to them as if they were still human. Frau Schmidt began to notice which children stopped raising their hands. She started keeping a separate notebook where she wrote the names of students who had disappeared from her class list. She did not show it to anyone. At night she sometimes opened it and read the names out loud, as if saying them could keep them from being forgotten. One evening a colleague stopped her in the hallway and asked why she had not joined the new teachers group. Frau Schmidt said she was busy with grading. The colleague smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and said everyone would have to choose soon. Frau Schmidt went home and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. She thought about the notebook in her desk and the books in the attic. She wondered when choosing silence had become the same as choosing sides. The seduction did not require anyone to become a monster overnight. It only asked them to take one small step, then another. It asked Hans to look away once. It asked the Goldsteins to accept one new restriction without protest. It asked Frau Schmidt to change one lesson plan. Each step felt reasonable at the time. Each step made the next one easier to take. The voice that had once sounded like hope began to sound like the only voice in the room. People who still heard other voices learned to keep them quiet. There were those who refused the steps. A woman who kept delivering milk to a Jewish family even after the deliveries were supposed to stop. A father who told his son that the new songs at school were not true, even when the boy came home upset. A shopkeeper who left his door unlocked at night so a neighbor could take food without being seen. These acts did not stop what was coming. They were too small, too scattered, too late to change the direction of an entire nation. But they kept something alive in the people who performed them, the knowledge that another choice had existed. That knowledge would matter later, when the cost of every silence became impossible to ignore. Hans would carry the memory of the older man at the rally for years. He would try to bury it under more meetings, more uniforms, more certainty. But the image returned at unexpected moments, when he passed the empty market stall, when he heard laughter that sounded too much like the crowd's roar. The Goldsteins would eventually face a night when staying was no longer possible. They would leave with one suitcase each and the note from the woman who had brought bread. Frau Schmidt would one day open the attic and find the books covered in dust. She would take them down and read them to herself, trying to remember who she had been before she learned to stay quiet. These were the ordinary people in an ordinary country who woke up one morning to find that the ground beneath their feet had shifted. Some had helped move it. Some had simply stood still while it moved. Some had tried, in small and frightened ways, to hold it in place. None of them could have imagined, in those early days, that their private fears and small kindnesses and quiet compromises would one day be examined under the lights of an international courtroom. They could not have known that the whisper they heard in the square would grow loud enough to shake the world, or that the answer to that whisper would have to be spoken not in the language of crowds, but in the careful, deliberate language of law. If these stories of ordinary men and women facing choices that would echo for generations have stayed with you, if you have felt, even for a moment, the pull of belonging and the cost of looking away, then you may want to connect more deeply with the courage that eventually rose to meet that darkness across the globe. For those who love history and want to hold a tangible piece of it or see the scale of that fight brought to life on screen, Amazon offers authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you touch the era, along with the powerful film Midway on Prime Video, which honors the bravery of those who stood against tyranny on every front. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The whisper had done its work. A nation had been taught, one small step at a time, to see its neighbors as the source of its pain. But the story does not end with the seduction. It continues with the long, painful awakening, the moment when the world realized that what had been done in one country would require a new kind of justice, one that reached beyond borders and into the conscience of every person who had chosen silence or looked away. That reckoning began in a courtroom built from the ruins of war. And the people who walked into that courtroom carried with them every quiet choice, every small resistance, and every ordinary compromise that had come before. Their stories are waiting for us there. A 12-year-old girl named Leah woke to the sound of her father's name being shouted from the street below, and in that single moment she understood that the safety she had taken for granted her entire life had been an illusion. Leah had gone to bed early that evening because her mother had seemed tired and the apartment above the family's small tailoring shop felt unusually quiet. She shared the narrow bed with her younger brother, who still slept with one arm flung across her pillow the way he had when he was a baby. Their father, a gentleman who hummed while he worked at his sewing machine, had stayed up late finishing a coat for a customer who had promised to collect it the next morning. Leah remembered hearing the low murmur of her parents' voices through the thin wall, something about a rumor that had reached the synagogue that afternoon. She had not caught the words, only the tone, the careful way adults spoke when they did not want children to worry. The shouting changed everything. It was not the usual noise of late-night revelers. These voices were organized, purposeful, and they carried the hard edge of authority. Leah sat up, heart hammering. Her brother stirred but did not wake. She slipped from the bed and padded to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. Below, in the yellow glow of the street lamp, a group of men in brown uniforms stood outside their building. One of them held a list. He called her father's name again, louder this time. Her father appeared at the shop door in his shirt sleeves, still holding the coat he had been finishing. He looked small and confused in the harsh light. Leah's mother came into the room then, moving quickly and silently. She gathered Leah and her brother close, pressing them against her so they could not see the window. But Leah had already seen enough. She had seen the way the men grabbed her father's arms, the way one of them struck him across the face when he tried to ask what was happening. She had seen the coat fall into the gutter. And she had seen, across the street, the silhouette of their neighbor, Herr Becker, standing at his own window, watching. Herr Becker, who had bought bread from their family for years, who had once helped her father carry a heavy bolt of cloth up the stairs. He did not come down. He did not shout for them to stop. He simply watched, and then he closed his curtain. That was the moment the trust between neighbors died for Leah. Not when the glass shattered later that night, though there would be plenty of that. Not when the synagogue at the end of the street began to burn, its roof collapsing in a roar of sparks that lit the sky like a false dawn. The trust died when a man who had known her family for a decade chose to look away rather than speak a single word in their defense. Across the city, in apartments and houses that had once felt like ordinary homes, the same scene played out in different variations. Families were pulled from their beds by fists on doors and boots on stairs. Men were dragged into the street while their wives and children watched from windows or were forced to follow. Shop windows that had displayed clothing, books, and groceries only hours earlier now lay in glittering piles on the pavement. The men who smashed them worked in groups, moving from one address to the next with a kind of grim efficiency that suggested they had practiced this before. Some wore uniforms. Others wore ordinary coats over their everyday clothes, as if they had been called from their own dinner tables to perform a civic duty. For the people inside those shops and homes, the night unfolded in fragments of terror and disbelief. Leah's mother kept her and her brother in the back room, whispering that they must be quiet, must not cry, must not make any sound that would draw the men upstairs. Leah could hear her father's voice from the street, asking again what he had done wrong. She could hear the sound of more glass breaking somewhere nearby, and the distant crackle of fire. Her little brother, still half asleep, asked in a small voice why the neighbors were not helping. Their mother had no answer. She simply held them tighter and rocked them as if they were much younger than they were. In another part of the city, a German couple named the Bergers sat in their kitchen with the lights off. Herr Berger had been a postman for 20 years. He knew the names and faces of almost everyone on his route, including the Jewish families whose mail he still delivered even after some of his colleagues had refused. His wife, Frau Berger, had taught piano lessons to several Jewish children before the new rules made it difficult. They had heard the rumors too, the whispers that something was planned for that night. When the first sounds of breaking glass reached them, Herr Berger stood up and reached for his coat. His wife asked where he was going. He said he could not sit and listen while people he knew were being dragged from their homes. She reminded him of their own 2 sons, asleep upstairs, and of the new laws that made helping a crime. They argued in low voices for several minutes. In the end, Herr Berger took off his coat and sat back down. They turned on the radio to drown out the noise from the street. The official broadcast said the disturbances were spontaneous expressions of public anger. It said nothing about trucks full of organized men or lists of addresses. The Bergers were not cruel people. They were ordinary, which in that moment was its own kind of tragedy. They had spent years telling themselves that the changes around them were temporary, that the worst would pass if they kept their heads down and their doors closed. On this night, when the worst arrived on their own street, they discovered that silence had become a habit too strong to break. Later, when the sun rose and the streets were filled with broken glass and stunned silence, Frau Berger would stand at her window and see the remains of a Torah scroll lying in the gutter outside the burned synagogue. She would cry then, quietly, so her sons would not hear. But on the night itself, she had simply turned up the radio. For the children who lived through those hours, the night carved itself into memory in ways that would never fully heal. Leah would remember the smell of smoke drifting through the broken window of their apartment, and the way her mother's hands trembled when she tried to braid her hair the next morning. She would remember the sight of her father being loaded into a truck, his face bleeding, and the way he tried to smile at her through the wire mesh as if to say everything would be all right. She would remember, most sharply of all, the face of her Becker at his window, and the terrible understanding that came with it, that people who had once nodded good morning could decide, in a single night, that she and her family were no longer neighbors at all. Some children tried to protect their parents in small, heartbreaking ways. A boy named Jacob, whose family lived above a bookshop, stood in front of the door when the men came, telling them his father was not home even though he could hear his father's breathing just behind him. The men pushed him aside without much force. He was only 10, but the look on his father's face when they took him anyway would stay with Jacob for the rest of his life. Another girl, Miriam, gathered her younger siblings into a closet and told them stories in a whisper to cover the sounds from outside. She was 14. She did not know if her parents were still alive. She only knew that her job, in that moment, was to keep the little ones from screaming. There were moments of unexpected grace amid the destruction. A German shopkeeper 2 doors down from the Levy family's tailoring business came out with a broom after the men had moved on. He began sweeping the glass from in front of his own store, then kept sweeping until he reached the Levy's broken window. He did not speak to anyone. He simply cleared a path through the debris so that when the family emerged, if they emerged, they would not have to walk barefoot over the shards. A woman who had once been a customer at the bookshop left a loaf of bread and a jug of water on the doorstep of a Jewish neighbor's home before dawn, then hurried away without knocking. These were not grand gestures of resistance. They were the smallest possible acts of humanity in a night designed to strip humanity away. And they mattered, because they proved that even when the state gave permission for cruelty, some people still chose otherwise. By morning the city looked as though a storm had passed through, except that storms do not carry lists of addresses or arrive in coordinated groups. Synagogues that had stood for generations were smoldering ruins. Shops that had been family businesses for decades stood with their contents strewn across the pavement or stolen. Men who had been taken in the night were gone, and no one could say where. The official explanation, when it came, spoke of righteous popular anger that had gotten out of hand. It did not explain the trucks, the uniforms, the careful selection of targets. It did not explain why the police had stood by or why fire brigades had been ordered to protect only neighboring buildings while synagogues burned. For the survivors, the morning after brought a new and terrible kind of silence. Neighbors who had once exchanged greetings now crossed the street. Shopkeepers who had once competed for customers now avoided eye contact. The broken glass was swept away eventually, but the broken trust remained. Children who had played together in the street the week before no longer met each other's eyes at school. Parents who had once borrowed sugar or shared recipes now kept their doors closed and their voices low. The night had done more than destroy property and take fathers. It had taught an entire population that their government could declare certain neighbors enemies and that most people would accept it, or at least not resist it. Leah and her mother spent the morning after picking through what remained of their shop. The sewing machine was smashed. Bolts of fabric had been dragged into the street and trampled. The coat her father had been finishing was gone. Her mother moved through the wreckage with a kind of numb efficiency, gathering what could be saved and setting aside what could not. Leah found a single button from her father's shirt lying near the doorway. She put it in her pocket and did not tell her mother. It felt like the last piece of him she might ever hold. In the days that followed, families who still had fathers or husbands alive waited for news. Some received letters from camps they had never heard of, written in handwriting that shook with cold or fear. Others received nothing. The radio continued to explain that the night had been a spontaneous outburst, a necessary correction. Newspapers printed photographs of the damage and captions that suggested the victims had brought it on themselves. For those who had lived through the night, the gap between what they had seen and what they were being told grew wider every day. That gap would become part of the wound that never closed. The educational weight of that night lay not in the scale of the destruction, though that was vast, but in what it revealed about how quickly a society could be taught to look away. People who had lived side by side for generations had been shown, in a single coordinated night, that their neighbors could be turned into targets and that the consequences for looking away were far lighter than the consequences for speaking up. The propaganda that had prepared the ground for years, the newspapers that called certain families parasites, the school lessons that taught children to see difference as danger, the laws that slowly stripped rights away one decree at a time, had done its work. When the moment came to act on that preparation, most people did not need to be ordered. They only needed to be told that their anger was justified and that no one would stop them. Yet even in that darkness, the small acts of kindness and the quiet refusals mattered. They mattered because they proved that the capacity for decency had not been entirely extinguished. They mattered because the people who performed them would carry the memory of their own courage or their own failure into the years that followed. And they mattered because, when the time came for accountability, those small choices would become part of the evidence that some people had seen what was happening and had still chosen to be human. The images from that night, the burning buildings, the shattered lives, the faces of children who learned too young that safety could vanish between one bedtime and the next, are seared into the historical record. Some of the rawest photographs and footage capture truths too painful and too graphic for this platform to show you directly. If you want to confront the unfiltered reality that survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives, there is a collection available that preserves those images without censorship or softening. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Those who lived through Kristallnacht understood something the rest of the world would take years to accept, that when a government turns its own citizens into targets and teaches neighbors to look away, the damage runs deeper than broken glass or burned synagogues. That night marked the moment when persecution stopped pretending to be temporary and revealed itself as a permanent policy of elimination. The people who swept up the glass the next morning, who searched for missing fathers, who tried to explain to their children why the world had changed overnight, could not have known that their private grief would one day become evidence in an international courtroom. They could not have imagined that the broken trust between neighbors would eventually demand a new kind of justice, one that would judge not only the men who gave the orders but the system that made those orders possible. That reckoning was still years away. But the night it became inevitable began with the sound of glass breaking and names being called in the dark. In a quiet villa overlooking a frozen lake, 15 men gathered around a polished table one winter morning, and while the coffee was still warm in their cups they began to discuss how to turn the deaths of millions into a matter of efficient administration. The villa had once belonged to a wealthy family who had left in a hurry. Now it served as a place where important but unremarkable meetings could happen away from the noise of the city. The men arrived in dark cars, their drivers waiting outside in the cold. They wore good coats and carried briefcases that held papers marked with careful handwriting. Some knew each other from previous work. Others were meeting for the first time. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the drive, and took their seats as if this were any other conference about budgets or railway timetables. At the head of the table sat a tall man with sharp features and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing he holds real power. He opened the meeting with a few crisp sentences about the need for coordination. The problem, he explained, was that too many different offices were handling the same issue in different ways. There had been shootings in the East, deportations from cities, labor assignments in camps, and all of it was becoming messy. What they needed was a single, clear policy that everyone could follow. He spoke calmly, almost like a manager calling a staff meeting to improve productivity. No one in the room raised their voice. No one seemed excited or angry. They simply nodded and opened their folders. One of the men at the table was a meticulous organizer who had spent years moving people from one place to another on paper. He kept detailed lists in his head and in his files: how many could fit in a train car, how much food they would need for a journey of several days, what documents would be required at each checkpoint. He had a wife and children at home. On the morning of this meeting, he had kissed them goodbye and reminded his oldest son to practice the piano. He believed in order. He believed that when a task was given, it should be carried out cleanly and without unnecessary suffering on either side. As he listened to the discussion about evacuation to the east, he made small notes in the margin of his pad. He was thinking about the children who would be on those trains. Not with pity, exactly, but with the practical concern of a man who hates waste. Children slowed things down. They required extra supervision. He wondered whether it would be better to separate them early. Across the table sat a lawyer who had helped write some of the earlier laws that had already stripped people of their rights and their property. He was proud of his work. He saw himself as a man who brought clarity to complicated situations. When the conversation turned to questions of mixed marriages and what to do with the children of those marriages, he spoke at length about legal definitions and degrees of ancestry. He used precise language, the kind that belonged in courtrooms and government offices. He did not raise his voice when he suggested that certain categories of people should be sterilized rather than deported. It was simply the most orderly solution, he said. The others listened and made their own notes. One man lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Another asked whether the foreign ministry had been informed. The discussion moved on. Outside the villa, the lake was covered with a thin layer of ice that caught the pale winter light. Inside, the men paused for lunch. Platters of cold meat and bread were brought in. They ate while continuing to talk. The organizer who kept lists mentioned a recent transport that had run into difficulties because too many people had tried to carry personal belongings. He suggested that in the future, people should be told they could bring only what they could carry in one hand. This would reduce delays at the loading points. Someone else remarked that the local populations in the East were sometimes uncooperative when new arrivals appeared. The tall man at the head of the table said that local cooperation was improving and that any resistance would be handled by the security forces already in place. The conversation never became heated. It remained a steady, professional exchange of men who were solving a large administrative problem together. What none of them said out loud, though some of them surely understood, was that the people being discussed were not abstract numbers on a page. There were families waking up in crowded apartments in cities hundreds of kilometers away. There were mothers trying to keep their children warm with too few blankets. There were old men who still remembered the names of streets that no longer existed for them. There were young couples who had fallen in love and married before the new laws made such marriages dangerous. In one city, a woman named Ruth was at that very moment standing in line for a small ration of bread, holding her daughter's hand and wondering whether the rumors about further deportations were true. She had already lost her husband to one of the earlier roundups. She did not know that across the country, in a villa by a lake, men who had never met her were deciding that her remaining days were now measured in train schedules and labor quotas. The men at the table did not think of Ruth or of anyone like her as individuals with names and fears and small daily hopes. They thought in categories. They spoke of the Jewish question and evacuation and special treatment. These words created distance. They turned living people into a problem that could be solved with the right forms, the right routes, the right allocation of trains and guards. One official, a man who had once worked in the civil service under a previous government, felt a brief flicker of unease when the discussion turned to the fate of children. He had grandchildren of his own. For a moment he pictured his own daughter's face if she were told her children would not be coming home. Then he pushed the thought away. This was different, he told himself. This was necessary for the future of the nation. Personal feelings had no place in policy discussions of this scale. He reached for another slice of bread and asked a question about the capacity of the camps that would receive the transports. The meeting lasted several hours. By the time the last point had been discussed and the last note taken, the winter light outside had begun to fade. The men gathered their papers, shook hands again, and returned to their cars. Some of them would go home to their families that evening. They would eat dinner, read to their children, perhaps listen to music on the radio. They would not speak of what had been decided at the villa. The organizer who kept lists would kiss his wife and ask his son whether he had practiced. The lawyer would review a different set of documents before bed. The tall man at the head of the table would dictate a summary of the meeting to his secretary the next morning, using the same careful language they had all used around the table. The summary would be distributed to the relevant offices. Work would begin. For the people whose lives had been turned into items on that summary, nothing changed immediately. Trains continued to run on their usual schedules for a little while longer. Families continued to wake, to work when work was still allowed, to hope that the worst rumors were exaggerations. But the machinery had been aligned. The different offices now had a shared understanding of what was expected. The language had been agreed upon. The responsibility had been spread so thinly across so many desks that no single person would have to carry the full weight of what was coming. That was perhaps the most important achievement of the meeting. It had made mass murder feel like the next logical step in an ongoing administrative process. There were moments even in that room when the human cost flickered at the edges of the conversation. One official mentioned in passing that some of the people being deported might try to hide or resist. He suggested that families should be kept together during transport because separated families were more likely to cause trouble. It was a practical observation, not a moral one. Yet for a brief second the image of a mother clutching her child on a crowded train platform hung in the air between the men. No one commented on it. The conversation moved to the next item on the agenda. The moment passed, and with it any chance that the reality of what they were planning might break through the professional calm. Outside the villa, in cities and towns and villages across the country and beyond, ordinary life continued its slow erosion. A boy delivered newspapers that no longer mentioned the names of people who had disappeared. A woman wrote a letter to her sister in another city and wondered whether it would ever arrive. A teacher stood in front of a classroom that had fewer students than it had the year before and tried to pretend that nothing important had changed. These were the people the men at the table had reduced to logistics. They did not know that their futures had been discussed over lunch in a villa by a lake. They only knew that each week brought new restrictions, new fears, new reasons to keep their heads down and their doors closed. The men who had sat at that table did not consider themselves monsters. They considered themselves realists. They believed they were solving a problem that previous generations had failed to solve. They believed that strong nations sometimes had to make hard decisions. Some of them even believed they were being merciful by making the process orderly rather than chaotic. The organizer who kept lists genuinely thought that clear instructions would reduce unnecessary suffering. The lawyer believed that precise legal categories would prevent arbitrary cruelty. They were able to hold these beliefs because the people they were discussing remained, in their minds, a category rather than individuals with faces and names and small daily acts of love and fear. That distance between the planners and the planned for is what made the meeting so dangerous. It allowed intelligent, educated men to treat the destruction of human lives as a technical challenge. It turned fathers and mothers and children into entries on a transport manifest. And because the discussion happened in a beautiful room with good food and polite conversation, it felt normal. It felt like work. That is how genocide becomes ordinary, not through shouted orders or dramatic declarations, but through meetings that end on time and memos that are filed correctly. When the last car pulled away from the villa that afternoon, the lake was already darkening. The ice had begun to thicken. Inside the empty rooms, the tables were cleared and the chairs pushed back into place. The villa returned to its quiet state, waiting for the next important but unremarkable meeting. The men who had attended carried their notes and their decisions back into the machinery of government. The trains would soon run on new schedules. The camps would receive new arrivals. The language that had been agreed upon in that room would spread through offices and across borders until it became the common tongue of destruction. For those who would later have to judge what had been done, the meeting at the villa would stand as one of the clearest examples of how ordinary men, sitting in ordinary rooms, could authorize the unthinkable without ever raising their voices. The documents that survived would show careful handwriting and precise language. They would not show the faces of the people whose lives were being measured in train cars and labor hours. That absence of faces, that reduction of human beings to categories and quotas, was the true cold calculation made that day. And it was a calculation that would require an entirely new kind of courtroom to confront. The stories of how ordinary administrators turned human lives into logistics are among the most important and most difficult to tell fully. Keeping the memory of those quiet decisions alive, the way they shaped millions of private fears and small daily acts of survival, takes time, careful research, and dedication. If the account you've just heard has moved you and you want to help sustain this kind of deep, human-centered storytelling so these lessons are never forgotten, you can leave a small tip of even $1 on Ko-Fi to support the work. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who left the villa that afternoon did not see themselves as the authors of tragedy. They saw themselves as the solvers of a problem that had grown too large for half measures. Yet the problem they solved on paper would become the lived nightmare of countless families who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong category at the wrong time. The distance between the comm table and the crowded trains, between the polite discussion and the terror in the night, is the distance that justice would one day have to measure. In a courtroom built from the ruins of what those men had planned, the question would not only be what had been done, but how it had been made to feel ordinary. That question would prove harder to answer than any transport schedule, and far more necessary. The train slowed under floodlights that turned the night into a harsh, artificial day, and in those first moments on the ramp, people who had once been neighbors, teachers, and parents discovered they had become cargo to be sorted. The journey had already stripped away almost everything. For days the cattle cars had rocked and jolted across the countryside, packed so tightly that it was impossible to sit without leaning against strangers. The air inside smelled of sweat, fear, and the sickness that came when there was nowhere to relieve oneself. Children cried until their voices grew hoarse. Old people sat with their heads bowed, conserving what little strength remained. In one corner of the car carrying the Weiss family, a young woman named Eva had spent the last hours whispering stories to the smaller children around her. She had been a teacher once, before the laws took her classroom away. Now she used the same steady voice she had once used for lessons, telling the children about a river she had seen as a girl, about the way sunlight looked on water. It was not the truth they needed. It was the sound of someone still trying to be human. When the doors finally opened, the sudden rush of cold air felt like a blow. Guards shouted in a language most of the people did not fully understand. Dogs barked. The light was blinding after the darkness of the car. Families clutched at one another, trying to stay together as they were herded onto a long platform. The Weiss family moved as one unit at first, the father holding his son's hand, the mother cradling their youngest daughter against her chest. They had promised each other on the train that whatever happened, they would not be separated. That promise lasted less than 2 minutes. A man in a uniform stood at the front of the platform. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed with a gloved hand, left or right. Left meant one direction, right meant another. The choice took only a second or two for each person. A mother was sent left while her child was sent right. An old man who could barely walk was waved to the left without a second glance. A young man who looked strong was sent right. The Weiss father tried to keep his hand on his son's shoulder, but a guard pulled them apart with a shove that sent the boy stumbling. The mother screamed once, a short, raw sound that was swallowed by the noise of the ramp. Then she was pushed left with the smaller child still in her arms. The father and son were sent the other way. In the space of a few heartbeats, the family that had traveled together for days no longer existed as a unit. They had become individual bodies to be processed. Eva was sent to the right. She had no children with her, and she was young enough and appeared healthy enough to work. As she walked away from the platform, she turned once and saw a woman she had spoken to on the train standing with two small children. The woman was being directed left. Their eyes met for a moment across the chaos. There was no time for words. Eva raised her hand in a small, helpless gesture, not quite a wave, more like an acknowledgement that they had both been human only minutes earlier. Then the crowd moved her forward and the woman was gone. The ramp itself was a place of terrible efficiency. Everything had been arranged so that the sorting could happen quickly. The trains arrived on schedule. The guards knew their roles. The doctors or officers who made the selections had done this many times before. There was no hesitation in their movements. A person who looked ill or old or too young was sent one way. A person who looked capable of labor was sent the other. The system did not care about names or stories or the letters some people still carried in their pockets, letters from relatives who had no idea this ramp existed. It cared only about immediate usefulness. That was the cruelty of it. The people on the ramp were not being punished for something they had done. They were being measured like parts in a machine that needed certain pieces and discarded the rest. For those sent to the right, the walk from the ramp led toward barracks and work details that would demand every remaining ounce of strength. Jacob, a man who had once helped hide families in the city before he was caught, found himself in a group of men being marched toward a line of wooden buildings. He had seen selections before in other places, but nothing on this scale. As he walked, he noticed a prisoner in a striped uniform standing near the ramp, watching the new arrivals with a face that showed nothing. Their eyes met briefly. The prisoner looked away first. Jacob understood. Survival here required learning not to see too much, not to feel too much. He wondered how long it would take before he learned the same lesson. Those sent to the left were taken to buildings where the air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something sweet and chemical that no one could yet name. There was no time for long goodbyes. There were no explanations. A few people tried to ask questions, but the answers were given with rifle butts or dogs. Most simply walked because walking was what the living did. A woman in that group held her daughter's hand and sang a lullaby under her breath, the same one she had sung when the child was an infant. The song was not for comfort anymore. It was an act of defiance so small that only the two of them could hear it. In a place where everything was being taken, even the right to name what was happening, she was still choosing to be a mother for as long as the walk lasted. The educational weight of the ramp lay in its speed and its impersonality. This was not rage or spontaneous violence. This was organization. The trains had been scheduled. The selections had been practiced. The people who did the pointing had been trained to see human beings as categories rather than individuals. A mother and child who had shared a bed the night before could be separated in seconds because the system required it. The quiet resilience that appeared in those seconds, the hand that reached out to steady a stranger, the whispered word of encouragement, the refusal to let go of a child until the last possible moment. These were the last expressions of humanity the system allowed. They did not stop the sorting. They did not change the direction of the lines. But they proved that even when everything else was being stripped away, some people still chose to reach for one another. After the ramp was cleared, the train was cleaned and prepared for the next transport. The platform was swept. The lights remained on, waiting. In the barracks on one side, new prisoners were given numbers and uniforms and instructions that would determine whether they lived another day or another week. In the buildings on the other side, the process that had been prepared for them continued without their consent or understanding. The men and women who had stood on the ramp only minutes earlier were already becoming part of the machinery they had not chosen. Eva spent her first night in the camp trying to remember the faces of the children she had told stories to on the train. She could not recall all of them. That failure felt like another loss. She told herself she would remember the stories instead, the ones she had invented to keep them calm. In the morning she was assigned to a work detail that carried stones from one place to another and back again. The pointless movement was part of the design. It exhausted the body and left little room for thought. Yet even there, small acts of resistance continued. A woman next to her on the line passed her a crust of bread when the guard looked away. Eva ate it slowly, letting it last as long as possible. The gift had cost the woman her own meal. That made it more than bread. It was proof that the sorting on the ramp had not succeeded in turning everyone into cargo. Jacob survived the first weeks by watching and learning. He saw which prisoners had found ways to protect one another and which ones had turned against their own. He chose the first group. When a new transport arrived and another selection happened on the ramp, he stood at a distance and watched the same process repeat. A father tried to push his son toward the group that seemed to be going to work. A guard struck the father and sent the boy the other way. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest, but he did not look away. Looking away was what allowed the system to continue. He made himself watch so that he would not forget why he was still breathing. The ramp at Auschwitz was not the only place where this sorting happened. Similar scenes played out at other camps and collection points across occupied territory. But the scale here, the speed, the way the entire process had been engineered to move thousands of people from train to selection to either labor or death in a single day, that was what made it possible for an entire population to be processed like freight. The men who had planned the logistics in offices far from the ramp had never stood on it. They had never heard the voices or seen the faces. They had only seen numbers on paper. The people on the ramp lived the consequence of those numbers. For those who survived the selection and the months that followed, the memory of the ramp never left. It returned in dreams and in sudden silences during the day. It returned when they tried to explain to themselves or to others why they had lived when so many had not. The answer was never simple. Some had been chosen for work because they were young or strong. Some had survived because a stranger had shared a piece of bread or a word of warning. Some had endured because they refused, in the smallest ways possible, to become only cargo. Those refusals did not stop the trains. They did not empty the camps. But they kept something alive that the system was designed to destroy. The stories of the ramps are the stories of how human beings were made to disappear in plain sight, sorted by strangers who had been taught to see them as less than human. They are also the stories of how, even in those final minutes, people still reached for one another. A hand on a shoulder. A song whispered to a child. A crust of bread passed in secret. These were the last acts of ordinary love and ordinary courage before the system swallowed them. They did not change the outcome for most. They changed what the outcome meant. They proved that the sorting never fully succeeded in erasing the humanity it tried to destroy. The full, unfiltered truth of those arrivals, the faces, the separations, the quiet defiance that no camera was meant to capture, lives on in raw footage and testimonies that cannot be shown openly on this platform. If the story of the ramps has stayed with you and you want to go deeper into the unedited realities and the long legacy that eventually led to the courtroom in Nuremberg, our Patreon community offers uncensored video sections, exclusive podcast episodes, and deeper explorations for history lovers who refuse to look away. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The people who stepped off those trains did not know they were walking into a place designed to erase them. They carried with them the last letters from home, the last stories they had told their children, the last small kindnesses they had shown one another on the journey. On the ramp, most of those things were taken in seconds. What could not be taken was the fact that they had been fully human right up until the moment the sorting began. That fact would later demand an answer in a courtroom where the men who had turned people into cargo would have to explain themselves. The ramp was where the system showed its true face. The survivors who carried its memory forward made sure that face could never again hide behind the language of efficiency or necessity. Their refusal to forget became part of the evidence that justice, when it finally came, would have to confront. The young man from a quiet village stood at the edge of a freshly dug pit with a rifle in his hands, and as the first group of people was brought forward, he discovered that killing could be made to feel like just another task on a long list of duties. Franz had never thought of himself as a soldier. He had been a baker in a small town, known for the way he remembered every customer's favorite loaf and for the gentle way he spoke to children who came into the shop with their mothers. When the call came for men of his age to report for special duty in the East, he went because refusing felt impossible and because the papers said it was important work for the security of the homeland. He told his wife he would write often. He told his young son he would bring back stories of the places he saw. He did not know then that the stories he would carry inside him could never be spoken aloud. The first time the unit was ordered to shoot civilians, the men were gathered in a clearing and told that the people they would face were dangerous enemies who had been helping partisans. The language was careful. It spoke of necessity and of protecting German lives. Franz listened and felt his stomach tighten. He had seen partisans. He had also seen old men and women and children in the villages they passed. When the first group was brought out, families who had been marched from their homes at dawn, he tried to look only at the ground. An officer walked along the line of shooters and spoke quietly to each man. When he reached Franz, he said that hesitation was understandable the first time, but that the work had to be done cleanly. Franz nodded because nodding was easier than speaking. When the order came, he raised his rifle with the others. The sound of the shots seemed to come from somewhere outside his own body. Afterward, he walked into the trees and was sick. He told himself it was the smell or the long day without food. He did not yet understand that something inside him had already begun to change. In the days that followed, the unit moved from village to village. Each time the process became a little smoother. The pits were dug in advance by local men who had been forced to help. The victims were brought in groups so the shooting could continue without long pauses. Franz learned to load and fire without thinking too much about the faces in front of him. He learned to drink the vodka that was passed around afterward because it made the nights quieter. Some of the men joked to keep the silence at bay. Others grew silent themselves and spoke only when orders were given. Franz wrote letters home that said little. He described the countryside and the weather. He asked about the bakery and about his son's schoolwork. He never mentioned the pits or the way the ground sometimes moved for hours after the shooting stopped. There were moments when the ordinary man he had once been pushed through the new routine. In one village, a woman recognized him from a previous stop and called out his name. She had bought bread from his shop years earlier when she had traveled through his town. For a second their eyes met and Franz felt the old habit of politeness rise in him. He almost nodded in greeting before he remembered where he was. The woman was taken with the others. Later that night he sat apart from the rest of the unit and tried to remember her face clearly. He could not. The faces were already beginning to blur together. The psychological shift happened in small steps that no one announced. At first the men told themselves they were only following orders and that the people they shot were guilty of something even if the details were never explained. Then they told themselves that the work was necessary to prevent worse things from happening. Then they stopped needing to tell themselves anything at all. The killing became part of the day's tasks, like digging the pits or cleaning the weapons. Franz noticed that some of the men who had been the most reluctant at the beginning now volunteered for the firing squads. They seemed almost eager, as if eagerness could prove they had never hesitated. He did not join them, but he also stopped looking away when the order was given. Looking away had become its own kind of effort. The survivors who escaped these shootings carried a different kind of knowledge. Miriam had been in one of the last groups brought to a pit outside a small town. She had walked with her mother and her younger sister, holding their hands so tightly that her fingers ached. When the shooting started, she felt herself falling forward into the pit. The weight of the bodies around her kept her from moving. She lay still, listening to the shots and the sounds of people still breathing beneath her. When the unit finally left, she waited until the darkness was complete before she tried to climb out. Her mother and sister were gone. She was covered in blood that was not all her own. She walked for days through the forest, hiding when she heard voices, drinking from streams, speaking to no one. The silence she carried afterward was not only grief. It was the knowledge that ordinary men in uniform had stood in a line and done this as if it were ordinary work. Miriam eventually found other survivors who had escaped similar pits. They shared what little food they had and took turns keeping watch at night. In those hidden groups, small acts of kindness became the only proof that the world had not completely ended. One man gave his coat to a woman who was shivering even though he had nothing else to wear. A woman who had once been a nurse cleaned a wound on a stranger's leg using strips torn from her own dress. These were not grand gestures. They were the last remains of ordinary decency in a world that had decided decency no longer applied to people like them. Miriam kept a small piece of paper with her, a fragment of a letter her mother had been writing before they were taken. She could not read it in the dark, but she kept it against her skin as if the words could still offer some protection. For the men who continued the shootings, the cost appeared in different ways. Franz began to have dreams in which the faces he could no longer remember during the day returned with terrible clarity. He woke sweating and reached for the vodka that was always available. Some of the men wrote letters they never sent, trying to explain to wives or parents what they could not say out loud. Others stopped writing altogether. The unit developed its own language for what they did, words that made the killing sound like a technical task rather than the destruction of families. When new men joined the unit, they were broken in quickly. The veterans showed them how to stand, how to aim, how to drink afterward so the shaking would stop. The new men learned the same lessons Franz had learned, that the first time was the hardest and that after the first time the work became easier if you did not think too much about who was standing in front of the rifles. The educational truth that emerged from these forests was not only about the cruelty of the orders. It was about how ordinary men could be brought to carry them out. Franz had not been raised to hate. He had not joined any political movement out of deep conviction. He had been a baker who loved his family and who wanted to believe that the work he was given served some larger purpose. The system that sent him to the pits gave him that belief in careful doses. It told him the people he was killing were a threat. It surrounded him with other men who were doing the same thing. It offered him alcohol and the company of his unit when the nights grew long. It never asked him to enjoy the work. It only asked him to continue. Most men found a way to continue. A few broke under the weight. A very few tried, in small and dangerous ways, to resist. One man in Franz's unit once looked the other way when a child ran into the trees. He was reported by another shooter and disappeared a week later. The lesson was clear. The line between following orders and becoming something unrecognizable to yourself was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Miriam and the other survivors who lived through the pits understood something the shooters never fully grasped. They understood that the men who killed them had once been someone's son or husband or neighbor. They understood that the same ordinary hands that fired the rifles could have been used to bake bread or hold a child. That knowledge did not make the killing less terrible. It made the moral failure larger. It meant that the capacity for this kind of destruction lived inside ordinary people under the right conditions, or the wrong ones. The men who stood at the edge of the pits were not monsters who had arrived from somewhere else. They were the product of a system that had taught them, step by step, that some lives no longer counted as fully human. Franz eventually returned home on leave. His wife noticed that he drank more than before and that he sometimes stared at nothing for long minutes. His son asked for stories from the east and Franz told him about the forests and the rivers but never about the pits. He tried to be the father he had been before, but the man who had stood in those clearings was still inside him. When he was ordered back to the unit, he went without protest. By then, the work had become the only life he knew how to live. The stories of these mobile killing units are stories of how the unthinkable became routine for the men who carried it out and how the survivors who escaped carried the memory forward as both wound and warning. They are stories of small kindnesses that survived even when everything else was being destroyed, the shared coat, the whispered comfort, the letter fragment kept against the skin. They are also stories of how a society can teach ordinary people to cross the line into mass murder without ever asking them to become villains in their own eyes. That lesson would later matter in a courtroom where the question would not only be what had been done, but who bore responsibility for teaching men to do it. The hidden operations of conscience during those years, the quiet refusals, the secret survivals, and the long aftermath carried by both the shooters and the survivors, belong to the shadow history of the war that is rarely told in full. If these accounts of ordinary men learning to kill and ordinary people learning to endure have stayed with you, and you want to explore more of the concealed operations and the forgotten individuals who shaped the hidden battles of that time, you can sign up for our free email newsletter where you'll receive the ebook The Shadow War, 5 top secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into those stories. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who learned to kill without limit in those forests and the people who survived them carried their separate burdens into the years that followed. Some of the shooters would later claim they had only followed orders. Some of the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to make the world understand what ordinary men with rifles had done in ordinary forests. Both truths would eventually stand before judges who had to decide whether following orders or learning to kill without limit could ever be an excuse. The answer that emerged from those courtrooms would shape the idea of justice for generations afterward. It would say that ordinary men are responsible for what they choose to do even when the orders are ordinary and the killing has been made to feel like work. That answer began in the clearings where Franz and men like him first raised their rifles, and in the forests where Miriam and others like her first learned how to disappear in order to remain human. A young American soldier from a small farming town kicked open the main gate of a camp he had been told held only political prisoners, and the smell that rolled out to meet him was the smell of death that had been left to rot in the open for too long. Private James had grown up walking behind a plow and believing that if you worked hard and treated people fairly, the world would mostly make sense. War had already taught him that was not always true, but nothing had prepared him for what waited inside those gates. The first thing he saw was a line of wooden barracks that looked more like animal sheds than buildings meant for people. Then he saw the people. They were standing or sitting or lying in the mud between the buildings, so thin that their joints looked too large for their bodies. Some of them turned their heads slowly when the soldiers entered. Others did not move at all. James felt his stomach turn and his rifle slip in his suddenly sweaty hands. He had come here to fight an enemy in uniform. He had not come here to walk into a place where the enemy had already finished its work on the living. Sergeant Ramirez, who had grown up in a crowded city neighborhood and had seen more of the war than most of the younger men, walked a few steps ahead of James. He had learned to keep his face steady no matter what the day brought. When he saw the first pile of bodies stacked like cordwood near one of the barracks, his steady face cracked for a moment. He stopped, lit a cigarette with hands that shook slightly, and then kept walking because stopping felt like giving in to something he could not name. Behind him, other soldiers from the unit were doing the same small, human things people do when the world stops making sense. One man sat down hard on the ground and put his head between his knees. Another walked over to a thin figure who was trying to stand and offered his canteen, then had to be told by a medic not to give too much water too fast because the body could not handle it after so long without. The survivors who could still speak began to tell their stories in broken sentences and in languages the soldiers did not understand. A woman with a shaved head and eyes that seemed too large for her face kept repeating one word over and over until someone found a translator. The word was mother. She was looking for her mother, who had been taken to another part of the camp weeks earlier. No one could tell her where that part of the camp was now. A man who had once been a teacher sat against the wall and spoke quietly in English about the books he had tried to hide and the students he had tried to protect. He did not ask for food or water. He asked only whether anyone had seen his wife and daughter, who had been sent in a different direction on the day they arrived. The soldiers listened because listening was the only thing they knew how to do in those first hours. They listened and they felt something shift inside themselves that would never shift back. James found himself standing in front of a barracks where the living and the dead lay together on wooden bunks. He had been raised to believe that every person deserved a decent burial. The sight of bodies that had been left where they fell made something break open in him. He stepped inside and spoke to a man who was still breathing. The man's voice was barely a whisper. He said he had been a doctor once. He said he had tried to keep people alive with nothing but his hands and his voice. James asked what he could do now. The doctor looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Tell them what you saw here. Tell them so it cannot happen again." James nodded because he could not think of anything else to say. Later, when he tried to write a letter to his mother back on the farm, he found that the words would not come. He wrote only that he was safe and that the war was nearly over. He did not write about the doctor or the smell or the way the living sometimes look more like ghosts than the dead. The first small acts of kindness between liberators and survivors happened almost by accident. A soldier who had grown up on a ranch in the American West saw a group of prisoners trying to move a man who could no longer walk. Without thinking, he put down his rifle and helped lift the man onto a stretcher one of the medics had found. The prisoners looked at him with a mixture of fear and something that might have been the beginning of trust. The soldier did not know their names and they did not know his, but in that moment they shared the simple work of carrying someone who could not carry himself. Another soldier found a hidden letter tucked inside the jacket of a man who had died only hours earlier. The letter was written in a language he could not read, but he carried it with him for days afterward, as if keeping it safe was a promise he could still keep. For the survivors, the arrival of the soldiers brought a strange and painful mixture of hope and grief. Some of them had stopped believing that anyone outside the barbed wire still knew they existed. When the gates opened and men in different uniforms appeared, the first reaction for many was not joy but a kind of stunned silence. They had lived so long inside a world where every day might be the last that the idea of a future felt dangerous. A young woman who had survived by hiding in plain sight among the stronger prisoners walked up to Sergeant Ramirez and offered him a small piece of bread she had saved from the last ration. It was the only thing she had to give. Ramirez took it, broke it in half, and gave one piece back to her. Neither of them spoke. The bread was hard and stale, but the act of sharing it was the first ordinary human exchange many of them had experienced in years. The shock of the liberators did not end when they left the camp. It followed them into the nights and into the letters they tried to write home. James kept seeing the doctor's face when he closed his eyes. Ramirez, who had thought he was beyond being surprised by war, found himself waking from dreams in which the thin figures from the camp stood at the foot of his bed and asked questions he could not answer. Other soldiers reacted with anger that had nowhere to go. They wanted to find the people who had run the camp and make them pay. Their officers told them that justice would come later, through courts and through evidence, not through more killing. Some of the men accepted that. Others carried the anger with them for the rest of their lives. The educational weight of those first days inside the camps was not only in the scale of the suffering. It was in the way the suffering made the earlier crimes feel suddenly, unbearably real. The soldiers who walked through the gates had heard reports and seen photographs. They had been told that terrible things were happening. None of that prepared them for the smell, the silence, the way the living sometimes looked at the liberators as if they might still be dreaming. The abstract idea of crimes against humanity became the concrete sight of a child who could no longer cry because there were no tears left. It became the sound of a survivor whispering the names of people who would never be found. That concrete reality is what turned the question of justice from something distant and political into something personal and urgent. The men who had opened the gates understood, in a way that no report could have made them understand, that what had been done here could not be answered with ordinary punishment. It required something new. In the weeks that followed, the soldiers and the survivors began to build small bridges between their two worlds. Medics worked without rest to save those who could still be saved. Soldiers shared their own food and their own blankets even when supplies were short. Survivors who could still stand began to tell their stories more fully, sometimes through translators, sometimes through drawings scratched in the dirt. One man drew a picture of the ramp where he had last seen his wife and children. He gave it to James without saying a word. James folded it carefully and kept it in his pocket until the day he was sent home. He never showed it to anyone. He simply kept it as proof that he had not imagined what he had seen. The courage of the liberators was not only in the fighting they had done before they reached the camps. It was in the way they stayed and tried to help after the fighting had ended for them. They had come across an ocean to defeat an enemy in uniform. They stayed to witness what that enemy had done to people who had no uniforms at all. That witness changed them. It changed the way they would see the world for the rest of their lives. It also changed the world itself, because the photographs and the stories that came out of those camps made it impossible for anyone to claim they had not known. The images burned their way into the conscience of nations. They made the later demand for justice feel not like the victory of the strong over the weak, but like the only possible answer to what ordinary people had been forced to endure. The men who walked into those camps carried with them the same courage that had carried other men across other oceans and into other battles against the same tyranny. They did not all come from the same country or speak the same language, but they shared the belief that some things could not be allowed to stand. If you want to honor that courage and see more of the fight that brought the world face to face with what had been hidden behind barbed wire, there are ways to hold pieces of that history and to watch it come alive on screen. Amazon offers authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you touch the era, and the powerful film Midway on Prime Video captures the scale of the struggle and the bravery of those who stood against tyranny on every front. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The liberators who opened the gates did not know then that the stories they carried would one day stand as evidence in a courtroom. They only knew that what they had seen could not be forgotten and could not be answered with silence. The survivors who met them at the gates did not know then that their whispered names and hidden letters would help build a new idea of justice. They only knew that someone from outside had finally come. In the space between those two groups of people, the soldiers who had come to end a war and the survivors who had endured its worst chapter, a new understanding was born. It was the understanding that some crimes are so vast and so personal that they demand more than victory. They demand that the world look at what was done, name it clearly, and decide together that it must never be allowed to happen again. That understanding began in the mud and the silence of the camps, in the small kindnesses that passed between strangers, and in the quiet promise that what had been seen would be remembered. In the shattered remains of what had once been a proud capital, a man who had once lived in palaces now moved through the rubble like a ghost, carrying only a small suitcase and the fading belief that his name might still buy him safety. Hermann Göring had spent the final weeks of the war trying to negotiate his own surrender on terms that would preserve some shred of his old power. He had sent messages through intermediaries, offering to meet with Allied commanders as if the war were a business deal that could still be settled over a table. When the messages went unanswered or were rejected, he retreated deeper into the countryside, changing cars and companions, always listening for the sound of approaching engines. He told himself that the Americans or the British would see reason. He was, after all, the man who had once been named as Hitler's successor. Surely someone on the other side would recognize that he was not like the others, that he had tried to moderate the worst excesses, that he still had value as a bridge to whatever came next. The suitcase he carried held a few changes of clothes, a bottle of the medicine he depended on, and a small photograph of his daughter that he took out and looked at when the nights grew long and quiet. The men hunting him did not see a negotiator or a bridge. They saw the face from the newsreels, the man who had promised that German bombers would darken the skies over enemy cities, the man who had stood beside Hitler while the first laws stripping people of their rights were signed. Sergeant Thomas Riley had been one of the soldiers who walked through the gates of a concentration camp only weeks earlier. He had seen the living skeletons and the piles of bodies. When his unit received orders to locate high-ranking officials who might be trying to disappear into the civilian population, Riley volunteered without hesitation. He carried a photograph of Göring in his pocket, but he also carried the memory of a child's face he had seen in the camp, a face that no longer looked like any child he had ever known. That memory made the hunt feel personal. It was not about capturing a famous name. It was about making sure the people who had built that camp had to stand in front of something more than a bullet. Göring was finally found in a small hunting lodge in the mountains. He had been traveling with a small group of aides and his wife and daughter. When the American soldiers surrounded the lodge, he came out with his hands raised, wearing a long leather coat and carrying a marshal's baton as if he were still on a parade ground. He smiled. He spoke in English. He asked to be taken to see Eisenhower. The soldiers who took him into custody treated him with the cold politeness of men who had been ordered not to harm prisoners but who had also seen too much to feel any warmth toward this particular one. One of them searched the suitcase and found the photograph of the little girl. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it back without comment. Göring noticed the gesture and said something about how even in war, a man remained a father. The soldier did not answer. In the days that followed, other high-ranking figures were pulled from their own hiding places. Some surrendered when they realized there was nowhere left to run. Others tried to slip across borders or blend into the stream of refugees moving through the ruined cities. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister who had once toasted the alliance with the Soviet Union and later signed the orders that sent people to their deaths, was found in a boarding house in Hamburg. He had dyed his hair and was using a false name. When the British soldiers knocked on his door, he tried at first to bluff his way through the conversation, claiming he was a businessman whose papers had been lost in the bombing. The soldiers showed him a photograph. He looked at it, then at their faces, and his shoulders sagged. He asked only that they allow him to say goodbye to the woman who had been sheltering him. She was not his wife. She was someone who had taken him in because she believed the war had already cost enough and that one more stranger in her house would not change the outcome. The soldiers waited while he spoke to her. They did not listen to what was said. They only heard the tone of a man who knew he would not see her again. The hunters themselves were changed by the work. Riley had expected to feel satisfaction when he helped bring in a man like Göring. Instead, he felt a complicated emptiness. He had imagined that capturing the architects would somehow balance the scales he had seen in the camps. It did not. The man in the leather coat with the photograph of his daughter did not look like the monster in the newsreels. He looked like a tired, middle-aged man who had run out of places to hide. Riley found himself wondering what the daughter in the photograph had been told about her father. He wondered whether she would ever be allowed to see him again. These thoughts did not make him doubt the necessity of the capture. They made the necessity feel heavier. Justice, he was beginning to understand, was not the same as revenge. Revenge would have been simpler. It would have ended with a single shot in the rubble. Justice required keeping these men alive long enough for the world to hear what they had done and why they had done it. There were moments of unexpected humanity even in the midst of the manhunt. In one small town, a local doctor who had quietly helped hide a Jewish family during the war recognized a former Gestapo officer trying to pass as a refugee. The doctor had every reason to turn the man over to the first Allied patrol he saw. Instead, he approached the officer in the street and told him, quietly, that he should leave the town before nightfall. He did not say why. He did not need to. The officer looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. The doctor never learned whether the man escaped or was caught later. He only knew that he had chosen, in that single moment, not to add one more death to the count he already carried in his own conscience. Small choices like that happened more often than the official reports would ever record. They did not change the outcome of the larger hunt, but they kept something human alive in people who had lived through years when humanity had been treated as a liability. For the captured leaders, the first days of custody brought a strange mixture of relief and dread. Göring, once he realized he would not be shot on sight, began to behave as if he were still a figure of importance. He asked for better food, for his medicine, for the right to speak with other prisoners. He wrote letters that were never delivered, trying to position himself as someone who could still be useful to the victors. Other prisoners reacted differently. Some withdrew into silence. Some tried to justify what had been done, speaking of duty and of orders that could not be questioned. A few asked, in private moments with their guards, whether their families were safe. The guards, following their own orders, answered only what they were permitted to answer. The silence that followed those questions was its own kind of answer. The educational truth that emerged from these captures was not only about the guilt of the individuals involved. It was about the choice the Allies made to bring them to trial rather than to the nearest wall. After everything that had been seen in the camps, after the photographs and the survivor testimonies and the smell that lingered in the noses of the liberators, the simplest response would have been to let the guns decide. Many soldiers and many civilians would have understood and even welcomed that response. Instead, the decision was made to keep these men alive, to gather evidence, to build a courtroom in a city that was still half in ruins, and to let the world watch while the accused answered for what had been done in their names and under their orders. That decision did not come from softness. It came from the belief that if the war had been fought to defend something more than victory, then the peace that followed had to be built on something more than vengeance. The men pulled from the rubble would have to stand not as symbols to be destroyed, but as individuals whose crimes could be named, examined, and judged in the open. Riley was eventually reassigned after Göring and several others had been delivered to the detention center that would hold them until the trial. Before he left, he visited the place where the prisoners were being kept. He stood outside the fence and watched Göring walking in the exercise yard. The man still carried himself with a kind of theatrical dignity, but the leather coat was gone and the marshal's baton had been taken away. Riley thought about the photograph in the suitcase. He thought about the child who would grow up without knowing, for many years, what her father had been part of. He thought about the child he had seen in the camp, the one whose face he could not forget. The two children would never meet. Their lives had been shaped by the same system in completely different ways. Riley turned away from the fence and did not look back. He had done what he had been sent to do. The rest would be for others to finish. The manhunt in the rubble was never only about finding the men who had given the orders. It was about deciding, in the most concrete way possible, what kind of justice would follow the war. The choice to capture rather than to kill, to question rather than to execute on the spot, to build a record rather than to close the book with a bullet, was itself an act of resistance against the logic that had produced the camps. It said that even the most powerful men could be held to account by something larger than their own power. It said that the rubble they had helped create would not be allowed to bury the evidence of what they had done. And it said that the ordinary soldiers and intelligence officers who did the hunting, the doctors who chose not to turn in a stranger, and the survivors who had already lost everything, were all part of the same story, a story that would now move from the ruined streets into a courtroom where the world would have to decide what it meant to call something a crime against humanity. The raw, unfiltered moments of these captures, the faces of powerful men reduced to fugitives in cellars and boarding houses, the expressions in the eyes of those who realized the chase was over, the quiet streets where ordinary people watched the old order being taken away, These are the kinds of images and footage that show the human reality behind the headlines in ways that are often too stark for open platforms to share directly. If the story of the hunt through the rubble has left you wanting to see more of those unsoftened truths, there is a collection of raw photographs and footage from the era and the trials available through Gumroad's Unseen Media Archive that preserves what could not be shown here. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who were pulled from their hiding places carried with them the last fragments of the system they had served. Some of them still believed, in those first days, that they might yet find a way to bargain or to justify or to disappear again. The soldiers and intelligence officers who found them carried the memory of what that system had produced. Between those two groups, in the ruined cities and the quiet conversations and the small choices that never made the official reports, a different future was being chosen. It was a future in which the powerful would have to answer in public for what they had done in private, and in which ordinary people would be asked to believe that law could still matter even after law had been used as a weapon for so long. That future began in the rubble, with men in uniform knocking on doors and men in hiding realizing there was nowhere left to run. It would be completed, or at least attempted, in a courtroom built from the same stones that had once sheltered the hunters and the hunted alike. In a city that had been turned into a landscape of ghosts and broken stone, a small group of lawyers and judges walked through the ruined halls of the Palace of Justice and began to build a courtroom that the world had never seen before. Robert Jackson had come from America carrying the weight of an idea that still felt larger than any one man could hold. He had stood in front of President Truman and agreed to lead the prosecution, not because he believed the task would be easy, but because he believed that if the war had meant anything at all, then the peace had to mean something more than victory. When he first arrived in Nuremberg, he stood on the steps of the half-destroyed palace and looked out over streets where entire blocks had simply ceased to exist. The air still carried the dust of collapsed buildings. People moved through the rubble with the slow, careful steps of those who no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet. Jackson turned to the small team that had traveled with him and said, almost quietly, that they were not here to win a case. They were here to invent the rules by which the case could even be judged. The Palace of Justice itself had survived the worst of the bombing with its outer walls still standing, though the roof was open to the sky in places and the windows were nothing but empty frames. Local workers had already begun clearing the worst of the debris. Some of them were men who had fought on the other side only months earlier. They moved the broken stone and twisted metal without speaking much to the newcomers. One of them, a quiet man named Heinrich who had lost his own son in the final weeks of the fighting, worked alongside an American engineer named Lieutenant Cole. They did not share a language at first, but they learned to point and nod and occasionally share a cigarette when the work paused. Heinrich had once believed that the war would protect his family. Cole had once believed that the war would end all wars. Neither of them spoke of those beliefs anymore. They simply worked on the same broken building, side by side, because the building had to be made whole before anything else could happen inside it. The legal team faced a problem that no textbook had prepared them for. The crimes they needed to address had no clear name in existing law. There had been wars before, and there had been atrocities, but never on this scale and never with this kind of bureaucratic machinery behind them. Jackson and his counterparts from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union sat in rooms that still smelled of damp plaster and smoke, arguing late into the night about how to define what had been done. They spoke of crimes against peace and crimes against humanity, phrases that had existed in speeches and treaties but had never been tested in a courtroom against living defendants. One evening, after a long day of debate, Jackson walked the empty corridors alone. He stopped in front of a wall where a faded portrait of a previous German judge still hung, its glass cracked. He looked at the face in the portrait and wondered whether the man had ever imagined that his courtroom would one day host the trial of the men who had once ruled the country. The thought stayed with him. It made the work feel both necessary and impossibly fragile. The translators who would have to carry every word across languages arrived carrying their own stories. Many of them were refugees who had fled Germany years earlier and were now returning to the country they had once called home. One young woman named Anna had left as a teenager when her family's shop was taken. She had spent the war years in London, working as a secretary and learning to speak English with almost no accent. When she was asked to return to Nuremberg as a translator for the tribunal, she said yes without hesitation, though she did not tell her new colleagues that she still had nightmares about the night her father was taken away. On her first day in the palace, she stood in the interpreter's booth that was still being built and looked down at the defendant's dock that would soon hold the men who had made those nightmares possible. She did not feel triumph. She felt a quiet, steady determination that the words she would speak would be the words that finally made the truth impossible to ignore. The judges who would ultimately decide the cases arrived with their own private doubts. They came from different legal traditions, different countries, different experiences of the war. Some had lost family members in the fighting. Others had spent the war years in relative safety, reading reports that had never fully prepared them for what they would see once they reached Germany. One of the French judges, a man who had defended resistance fighters during the occupation, walked through the camp at Dachau before the trial preparations began in earnest. He did not speak for a long time afterward. When he finally returned to the discussions about courtroom procedure, he spoke more softly than before, but with a new clarity. He said that the law they were building had to be strong enough to survive the anger that any human being would feel after walking through those gates. It had to be strong enough to protect even the men who had built the gates. Small acts of ordinary humanity kept the work moving when the scale of the task threatened to overwhelm everyone involved. In the evenings, after the formal meetings ended, members of the different national teams sometimes shared whatever food they had managed to find in the city. An American prosecutor and a Soviet colleague once sat on the steps of the palace sharing a loaf of bread and a tin of something that passed for meat. They could not agree on many of the legal questions that had filled their day, but they could agree that the bread tasted better when it was broken in half. A British secretary who had lost her brother in the war found herself helping a German typist whose own brother had been killed on the other side. They did not talk about the war. They talked about the difficulty of finding decent tea in a city where almost everything had been destroyed. Those small conversations did not solve the larger problems, but they kept the people doing the work from becoming only the sum of their national positions. The logistical challenges were constant and exhausting. The city had almost no reliable electricity. The team had to bring in generators and wire the courtroom themselves. Translators worked in shifts because there were not enough people who could move fluently between English, French, Russian, and German. Security had to be arranged for the defendants who were already in custody and for the witnesses who would soon arrive. Every decision carried moral weight. When the team debated whether to allow the defendants to choose their own lawyers or to appoint counsel for them, the discussion was not only about procedure. It was about whether the trial they were building would be remembered as justice or as theater. Jackson argued passionately that the defendants must have real representation, even if that representation would be used to attack the tribunal itself. He believed that if the trial was to mean anything lasting, it could not begin by denying the very rights it claimed to defend. The city itself watched with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The people of Nuremberg had lived through the bombing and the occupation. Some of them had lost everything. Others had quietly opposed the regime in small ways that had never been enough to change its course. When they saw the lights come on again in the Palace of Justice and heard that a trial was being prepared, reactions varied. An older woman who sold vegetables from a cart near the palace stopped one of the American guards one morning and asked, in broken English, whether the men who had started the war would finally have to explain themselves. The guard, who had been in the city only a few weeks, nodded. He did not know how to say more. The woman nodded back and went back to arranging her vegetables. It was a small exchange, but it stayed with the guard for a long time. It reminded him that the trial was not only for the lawyers and the judges. It was for the people who had lived under the system that was now on trial. As the opening day approached, the weight of what they were attempting settled more heavily on everyone involved. Jackson wrote long letters to his wife back in the United States, letters he knew might never reach her in time to matter. In one of them he described walking through the empty courtroom at night, when the work crews had gone home and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. He wrote that the room felt both too small and too large at the same time, too small to contain the crimes it would have to judge, too large to be filled by any words the prosecution could offer. He ended the letter by saying that he still believed the work was worth doing, even if he could not yet see how it would end. He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket, though he knew he might never send it. The birth of the tribunal was never a single moment of triumph. It was a long series of small, stubborn decisions made by tired people in a broken city. They argued, they compromised, they doubted themselves and each other, and they kept going because stopping would have meant accepting that the crimes they had seen could only be answered with more violence or with silence. The courtroom they built was imperfect. The law they shaped was new and would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. But the fact that they built it at all, in a city of ghosts and rubble, with former enemies working side by side and survivors watching from the edges, was itself an act of quiet defiance against everything the defendants had once represented. The story of how ordinary men and women, carrying their own private griefs and hopes, came together in the ruins to create something that had never existed before is one of the most important and least told chapters of that time. Keeping the memory of their doubts, their small kindnesses, and their stubborn belief that law could still matter alive requires time, care, and the kind of dedicated research that turns forgotten details into living history. If these accounts of the people who built the tribunal have moved you and you want to help sustain this kind of storytelling so these lessons are never lost, you can leave a small tip of even $1 on Ko-Fi to support the work. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the first session finally opened, the men who had argued late into so many nights sat in their places and watched the defendants enter the dock. The room was not perfect. The translation system still failed on certain words. The lighting was uneven. But the fact that the session happened at all, in a city that had been left in ruins by the very men now sitting under guard, was proof that something new had been born. It was not yet clear whether that new thing would survive the months of testimony and argument ahead. It was not yet clear whether the world would accept that law could reach into the highest offices of a fallen state. But the people who had built the tribunal had already done something that mattered. They had refused to let the rubble have the final word. They had insisted that even in a city of ghosts, justice could still be invented, one careful decision at a time. That insistence would be tested in the days to come, but it would never be taken back. In the wooden dock of a courtroom built from the ruins of their empire, 22 men who had once commanded nations and shaped the fate of millions now sat under the steady gaze of the world, and for the first time many of them looked smaller than the titles they had carried. Hermann Göring entered first, still carrying himself with the theatrical confidence of a man who had once believed he could negotiate his way out of anything. He had lost weight during captivity, but he had not lost the habit of command. He glanced at the judges as if they were late for a meeting he had called, then settled into his seat and adjusted the earphones that would carry the translation. In the months before the trial began, he had written letters to his wife and daughter that mixed defiance with a strange, almost tender concern for their comfort. He told them not to worry, that he would explain everything when this was over. He did not write about the camps or the orders that had carried his signature. He wrote instead about the unfairness of being judged by men who had never understood the pressures of leadership in wartime. To the guards who brought him his meals, he was often polite, sometimes charming, occasionally demanding. One young American guard later remembered how Göring once asked about the guard's family back home and then, in the same breath, offered advice on how the young man might advance his career after the trial ended. It was as if Göring still believed the world would eventually return to normal and that his name would once again open doors. Beside him sat Rudolf Hess, the man who had once been Hitler's deputy and who had flown alone to Scotland in 1941 on a mission no one fully understood even now. Hess stared straight ahead with an expression that rarely changed. He spoke little in the months leading up to the trial, and when he did speak it was often to insist that he remembered nothing of the years before his flight. The doctors who examined him could not agree whether his memory loss was genuine or strategic. His lawyers struggled to prepare a defense because their client would not help them. In his cell, Hess spent long hours writing letters that were never sent, letters addressed to a Führer who was already dead. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a sentence and simply stare at the wall. The guards learned to check on him more often than the others because there was something about his stillness that felt dangerous in a different way from Göring's bluster. Albert Speer, the architect who had risen to become Minister of Armaments, sat a few places away. He was the youngest of the major defendants and the one who had already begun to shape a different story about himself. In letters to his family and in conversations with his lawyer, Speer admitted that mistakes had been made and that he accepted responsibility for the use of forced labor in the factories under his control. He did not, however, speak of the camps or of the broader machinery of extermination. He presented himself as a technocrat who had been focused on production and who had tried, in small ways, to moderate the worst excesses. Whether this remorse was genuine or calculated would be debated for decades. What was clear in the months before the trial was that Speer was watching the other defendants carefully, calculating which alliances might still be useful and which stories might still be believed. He was polite to the guards and occasionally offered small kindnesses, once sharing a book he had been allowed to keep with a fellow prisoner who had nothing to read. The gesture was noted and remembered by those who observed it. Julius Streicher, the publisher of the most vicious anti-Jewish newspaper in Germany, entered the dock with a different kind of energy. He had been the most openly hateful of the group, the one who had called for violence in the plainest language. In captivity he remained unrepentant. He told his lawyer that he had done nothing wrong and that the Jews had brought everything on themselves. He spent time in his cell drawing crude cartoons and writing letters that repeated the same poisonous arguments he had printed for years. The other defendants mostly avoided him. Even Göring, who could be charming when he chose, kept his distance. Streicher seemed not to notice or not to care. He sat in the dock with the same defiant posture he had once used on the speaker's platform, as if he still believed that hatred alone could be a form of power. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister who had negotiated the pact with the Soviet Union and later the declarations of war, looked smaller and more ordinary than his old newsreel image. In the months before the trial he wrote long, rambling letters to his wife in which he tried to explain that he had only been following the Führer's instructions and that he had never known the full extent of what was happening in the East. Whether he was telling the truth or simply trying to save himself was impossible to know from the letters alone. What was visible in the courtroom was a man who had once moved easily among the powerful and who now sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the charges was already pressing down on him. He listened carefully to the translations and occasionally made notes on a small pad, still behaving like a diplomat at a difficult conference rather than a man on trial for his life. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who had signed so many of the orders that sent soldiers and civilians to their deaths, sat with the rigid posture of a lifetime military man. He had already written a statement accepting responsibility for the actions of the Wehrmacht under his command. In conversations with his lawyer he spoke of duty and of the impossibility of questioning orders from above. He did not speak of the human cost of those orders. When he looked at the other defendants, his expression was often one of quiet disapproval, as if he still believed that professional soldiers should behave differently from the political figures around him. In his cell he read military history and wrote letters to his wife that focused on practical matters, the disposal of property, the education of their children, as if he were preparing for a long absence rather than a possible death sentence. These were not the cartoon villains that propaganda on both sides had sometimes made them out to be. They were intelligent men, many of them highly educated, who had risen through a system that rewarded ambition, loyalty, and the ability to look away from inconvenient truths. Some had joined the Nazi movement early because they believed in its promises of national revival. Others had joined later because it offered the fastest path to power in a country that was being remade. Almost all of them had convinced themselves, at one point or another, that the ends justified the means and that the suffering of certain groups was a necessary price for the greater good of the nation. They had written the laws, signed the orders, and overseen the bureaucracies that turned human beings into categories and then into corpses. Yet in the months before the trial, when they were no longer protected by the machinery they had built, they revealed the same mixture of fear, denial, calculation, and occasional unexpected humanity that exists in ordinary people everywhere. Göring's charm could still surface in small moments. He once asked a guard about a book the young man was reading and then offered his own thoughts on the author, as if they were simply two readers discussing literature rather than captor and captive. Speer continued to work on his defense strategy with careful attention to detail, treating the trial as a problem that could be solved with the right presentation of facts and the right tone of measured regret. Hess remained in his own world, speaking rarely and seeming at times to forget where he was. Streicher continued to rage against the Jews even when no one was listening. Ribbentrop's letters grew more desperate as the opening of the trial approached. Keitel maintained his military bearing even when the evidence against him mounted. The educational weight of seeing these men as human beings rather than as monsters was not that it excused what they had done. It was that it made clearer how such things could happen in the first place. These were not men who had arrived from some other moral universe. They were products of the same human capacities for ambition, fear, rationalization, and loyalty that exist in every society. They had used those capacities to build and maintain a system of mass murder. Understanding that did not diminish their guilt. It made the guilt more frightening because it meant that the same combination of ordinary human traits could, under the right conditions, produce similar results again. The trial would have to confront not only what these men had done but how they had come to believe that what they were doing was necessary or even virtuous. In the cells beneath the courtroom, the defendants continued to live their small daily lives while the world prepared to judge them. They received letters from family members when the censors allowed it. They spoke with their lawyers about strategy and evidence. They ate the food provided by their captors and walked in the exercise yard when permitted. Some of them prayed. Some of them wrote memoirs that would later be published. Some of them simply waited. The guards who watched over them saw the same range of human behavior that could be found in any prison anywhere, moments of kindness between prisoners, moments of pettiness, moments of genuine fear when the reality of what lay ahead became impossible to ignore. The men in the dock were not the only ones carrying the weight of what had happened. The prosecutors and judges who would judge them were also ordinary human beings trying to build something new out of the wreckage. But it was the faces of these 22 accused that would become the most visible symbols of the trial. Their expressions in the dock, Göring's defiant smile, Hess's blank stare, Speer's careful attentiveness, Streicher's unrepentant glare, would be photographed and remembered long after the legal arguments had faded. Those faces reminded the world that the crimes had been committed not by abstract forces but by specific men who had once been someone's colleague, someone's husband, someone's father. That reminder made the demand for justice both more personal and more urgent. The full, unfiltered record of these men, their private letters, their unguarded moments in captivity, the deeper layers of their ambitions and their fears, lives on in archives and testimonies that cannot be shown openly on this platform. If seeing these human faces behind the titles has made you want to explore the trial and its legacy without softening or censorship, our Patreon community offers uncensored video sections, exclusive podcast episodes, and deeper explorations for history lovers who want to understand how ordinary ambition and ordinary fear can combine to produce extraordinary evil. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the trial finally began, the 22 men in the dock would be forced to listen to the evidence of what their system had done. Some would continue to deny. Some would attempt to shift blame. Some would try to explain themselves in ways that still preserved a shred of dignity. The courtroom would become the place where the human faces behind absolute evil would be held up to the light of public examination. What the world would learn in those months was not only the scale of the crimes, but the ordinary human mechanisms that had made those crimes possible. The men in the dock were not demons. They were something far more dangerous, intelligent, ambitious, frightened, and sometimes even kind human beings who had chosen, step by step, to build and serve a machine of death. That choice, and the consequences of it, would now be judged in the same ruined city where they had once held power. The faces in the dock were the faces of the system itself, and the trial would ask whether those faces could ever again be allowed to shape the fate of nations. The first reel of film began to flicker across the screen in the darkened courtroom, and as the images of skeletal figures stumbling through mud and the silent testimony of mass graves filled the space, the men who had once signed the orders that created those graves began to look away, or to stare too intently, or to shift in their seats as if the wooden dock had suddenly become too small to contain what they were being forced to see. Robert Jackson stood at the prosecutor's table with the calm authority of a man who knew the evidence he was about to present would do more than convict. It would make denial impossible. He had spent months preparing for this moment, working with teams that had gathered documents from every corner of the fallen regime, orders signed by the men now sitting in the dock, reports from units that had carried out mass shootings, internal memos discussing the logistics of moving people to their deaths as if they were discussing the movement of freight. Jackson understood that words alone might not be enough. The defendants had spent years mastering the art of bureaucratic language, the careful phrasing that turned murder into evacuation and special treatment. So he had brought the films. The first film was raw footage shot by Allied cameramen who had entered the camps only days or weeks after liberation. There was no narration at first, only the unsteady images of American and British soldiers walking through gates that had once kept people in and the world out. The camera lingered on faces, hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over bone, the slow, uncertain movements of people who had forgotten how to walk without fear. In the gallery, translators leaned forward, their voices low as they rendered the images into words for the judges and the defendants. One translator, a young woman who had lost her own family in the East, paused for a moment when the film showed a group of children standing together, too weak to play, too alive to be counted among the dead. She swallowed hard, then continued. The men in the dock watched in silence. Goring, who had spent the early days of the trial smiling and adjusting his earphones as if this were all a misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up, sat very still. His usual expression of confident irritation had faded. He looked, for the first time, like a man who was beginning to understand that the evidence would not be argued away. The documents came next, one after another, in a steady, relentless stream. A memo from a regional official reporting that the Jewish problem in his district had been solved through resettlement. An order signed by one of the defendants authorizing the use of prisoners for medical experiments. A report from an Einsatzgruppen unit listing the number of people shot in a single day, the numbers broken down by age and gender as if the killers were keeping inventory. The prosecutors read these aloud in calm, measured voices. They did not need to raise their voices. The words themselves carried the weight. When a document mentioned a particular defendant by name, the camera operators in the courtroom would turn their lenses toward that man's face. Some looked defiant. Some looked bored. Some looked down at their hands. One defendant, a military commander who had signed countless orders for reprisals against civilians, was seen to wipe his eyes with a handkerchief. Whether the tears were for the victims or for himself was impossible to know from a distance. The impact on the defendants was not uniform, but it was visible. Goring recovered some of his bluster after the first day of films and documents. He told his lawyer that the films were staged, that the documents were forgeries or taken out of context. Yet in the evenings, when he returned to his cell, he wrote letters to his wife that were shorter and less confident than before. He complained about the food and the guards, but he did not write about the evidence. Hess continued to stare straight ahead, his face blank, as if the words and images were passing through him without leaving a mark. Speer took notes. He had already begun to position himself as someone who had been horrified by what he now saw, a man who had tried to limit the damage from within. Whether the notes were for his defense or simply a way to keep his hands busy was unclear. Stryker, the most openly hateful of the group, watched the films with the same expression he had worn on the streets years earlier, a mixture of contempt and satisfaction, as if even now he believed the images confirmed something he had always known. The others reacted in their own ways. Some shifted in their seats when a document bearing their signature was read. Some leaned forward as if trying to hear better. Some simply closed their eyes for a moment when the films showed children. In the gallery, the effect was different but no less profound. Journalists who had covered the war from a distance now sat in silence, their notebooks open but their pens still. Some of them had seen the camps themselves. Others had only heard the rumors. The films made the rumors concrete. A French journalist who had lost colleagues to the occupation wrote later that he had expected to feel anger. What he felt instead was a kind of exhausted grief, as if the images had confirmed something he had already known but had not wanted to believe. In the translator's booth, the young woman who had paused at the sight of the children found herself thinking of her own younger brother, taken years earlier. She had not allowed herself to cry during the war. She had worked and survived and told herself that grief was a luxury she could not afford. Now, listening to her own voice translate the images of other children who had not survived, she felt the tears come anyway. She kept translating. The work did not stop for personal sorrow. The prosecutors themselves were not immune. Jackson had prepared for this moment with the cool precision of a lawyer who believed in the power of evidence. But even he paused once, after a particularly detailed report was read, and looked out at the courtroom as if gathering his thoughts. The pause lasted only a few seconds, but it was noticed. Later, in a letter to his wife that he never sent, he wrote that he had not expected the evidence to affect him so deeply. He had known what the documents would say. He had seen the films in preparation. Yet hearing the words spoken aloud in a courtroom, watching the faces of the men who had signed them, made the reality settle in a different way. It was no longer abstract. It was no longer something that had happened far away to people he did not know. It was here, in this room, in the faces of the men who now sat under guard and in the faces of the translators and observers who had lived through it. The educational power of this avalanche of evidence lay not only in what it proved but in how it proved it. The defendants had spent years building a system that relied on distance and language. Orders were given in careful, administrative terms. Reports were filed with numbers rather than names. The films and documents removed that distance. They showed the bodies. They showed the signatures on the orders that had sent the bodies to their deaths. They showed that the system had not been a series of unfortunate excesses by overzealous subordinates. It had been planned, coordinated, and documented at every level. The men in the dock could no longer claim they had not known. The evidence was there, in their own handwriting, in the films shot by their own countrymen and by the liberators who had arrived too late to save the dying but in time to record what had been done. Small moments of humanity continued even in the midst of this confrontation with horror. A guard once brought a glass of water to one of the defendants who had begun to cough during a particularly long reading of a document. The gesture was automatic, the kind of small kindness one person offers another without thinking. The defendant nodded his thanks. Across the room, a survivor who had been allowed to observe the proceedings sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. When the film showed a group of women being herded toward a building, she closed her eyes for a moment. A translator sitting near her reached over and touched her arm lightly, a wordless gesture of solidarity. Neither woman spoke. The touch was enough. The defendant's reactions evolved as the days of evidence continued. Some began to look older, as if the weight of what was being shown was aging them in real time. Others maintained their composure through sheer force of will. Goring occasionally whispered to his lawyer, offering suggestions or objections that were duly noted and usually overruled. Speer continued to take notes, his expression one of careful attention, as if he were still a minister reviewing reports rather than a defendant watching the record of his own complicity. Hess remained in his own world. Stryker continued to glare. The others found their own ways to endure. What none of them could do was make the evidence disappear. The documents remained. The films remained. The signatures remained. The numbers in the reports remained, each one representing a life that had been taken because someone in that dock had decided it should be taken. The world outside the courtroom watched through the reports of journalists and through the newsreels that would later carry excerpts of the evidence. For many people, this was the first time the full reality of what had happened in the camps and in the killing fields of the East became impossible to deny or to minimize. The abstract idea of atrocities became the concrete sight of bodies being bulldozed into pits. The distant reports of resettlement became the documented orders signed by men whose faces were now familiar from the newsreels of the trial itself. The evidence did more than convict the defendants. It changed the way the world understood what had been done and what would be required to prevent it from happening again. The hidden efforts that had brought this evidence to light, the intelligence operations that located and preserved the documents, the brave individuals who had risked everything to smuggle reports out of offices and camps, the survivors who had carried their stories through years of silence until they could be heard. These are the kinds of concealed operations and unsung heroes that shaped the outcome of the war in ways that are rarely told in full. If the power of these documents and films to break through denial has stayed with you, and you want to explore more of those hidden stories and the forgotten people who helped bring the truth into the light, you can sign up for our free email newsletter where you'll receive the ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into those concealed chapters of the conflict. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the last reel of film had been shown and the final document had been read into the record, the courtroom was quiet for a long moment. The prosecutors had done what they set out to do. They had presented not arguments but proof that could not be explained away by claims of ignorance or necessity or superior orders. The men in the dock had been forced to confront the reality of what their signatures had authorized and what their silence had permitted. Some of them would continue to deny. Some would attempt to explain. Some would simply endure. But none of them could any longer pretend that the crimes had been committed by someone else, in some other place, without their knowledge or participation. The avalanche of evidence had done its work. It had buried the possibility of denial under a weight of documents and images that no amount of legal maneuvering could shift. The trial would continue for months, with defense arguments and cross-examinations and the testimony of survivors still to come. But the foundation had been laid. The truth had been placed on the record in a way that could not be erased. And that truth would now have to be answered, not with more words or more films, but with the judgment that would eventually be rendered in the same room where the evidence had been shown. A woman who had once taught children in a quiet classroom stood in the witness box of an international courtroom and began to speak the names of students who would never grow up, and in that moment the charge of crimes against humanity stopped being an idea and became the story of children whose faces she could still see when she closed her eyes. She had survived Auschwitz by learning which guards to avoid and which work details offered the smallest chance of living another day. She had watched friends disappear into the gas chambers and had carried the bodies of those who collapsed during roll call. When the invitation to testify arrived, she had sat with the letter for 3 days before answering. Her husband, who had also survived, asked her not to go. He said the world already knew enough. She told him the world knew numbers and photographs. It did not yet know the names. She packed a small suitcase, wrote a short letter to her sister who had not returned from the camp, and boarded the train that would take her to Nuremberg. On the journey she kept the letter in her coat pocket and touched it whenever the old fear rose in her throat. The fear was not of the defendants. It was of speaking the truth out loud and discovering that even now, after everything, some part of her still expected to be punished for it. When she entered the courtroom, the wooden dock where the accused sat was already full. She did not look at them at first. She looked instead at the judges, at the prosecutors, at the translators who would carry her words into languages she did not speak. The prosecutor who called her forward spoke gently. He had met with her earlier in a small room where sunlight came through a high window and fell across a table covered with papers. He had asked her to tell only what she had seen herself, nothing more. She had nodded. She had spent years learning to measure what could be said and what could not. Now she stood in the box and the prosecutor asked her name, her age, where she had been on a particular day in 1944. She answered clearly. Her voice did not shake. Then he asked her to describe what happened to the children who arrived on the same transport as her own son. She had not planned to speak of her son. She had decided, in the small room with the sunlight, that she would speak only of what she had witnessed happening to others. But when the question came, the name of her son was already in her mouth. She said he had been 8 years old. She said he had held her hand until the moment the guards separated them. She said she had watched him walk toward a building she later learned was not a shower. Her voice remained steady until she reached the part where she described the sound the children made when they realized they were not being given water. Then it broke. She stopped. The translator waited. In the dock, one of the defendants looked down at his hands. Another continued to stare straight ahead. A guard standing near the witness box stepped forward without being asked and placed a glass of water on the ledge in front of her. She drank. She thanked him in a whisper. Then she continued. The courage required to stand in that box was not the loud courage of battle. It was the quieter kind that comes from deciding that silence would be a greater betrayal than pain. Other witnesses followed her. A man who had survived a mass shooting in a forest outside a small village described lying beneath the bodies of his neighbors while the shooting continued above him. He spoke of the weight of the dead pressing down on his chest and of the moment when the last shot was fired and the soldiers walked away laughing. He had waited until dark before climbing out. He had walked for 3 days without food or water, hiding in ditches when he heard voices. When he reached the witness box, he carried a small photograph of his wife and daughter. He placed it on the ledge before he began to speak. The prosecutor did not ask him to show it. The man simply needed it there. A resistance fighter who had helped move people across borders before the war and later carried messages between hidden groups described the night she was caught. She had been tortured. She had given no names. She spoke of the small acts of defiance that had kept her alive, refusing to look at the floor when ordered, refusing to thank her interrogators for water. She did not describe the torture itself. She said only that there were days when the only thing that kept her from speaking was the thought of the children she had helped move to safety. Those children were now adults. Some of them had written to her after the war. She carried one of those letters in her pocket during her testimony. After she finished speaking, she asked the court's permission to read a single sentence from it. The judges agreed. The sentence was simple. It said, "Because of you I am here to write this." She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her pocket. Then she stepped down. The impact of these testimonies on the courtroom was not measured in legal points scored. It was measured in the way the air changed when a witness described a child's hand slipping from a mother's grasp, or the sound of a single shot that ended a life that had once held ordinary hopes. The defendants reacted in their own ways. Some continued to take notes as if they were still reviewing administrative reports. Others looked away when the descriptions became too specific. One defendant, a man who had overseen the administration of several camps, was seen to remove his glasses and clean them repeatedly during a particularly detailed account of selections on the ramp. Whether the gesture was a way to avoid the witness's eyes or simply a nervous habit was impossible to know. The prosecutors listened with the same careful attention they had given to the documents and films. They had prepared the witnesses gently, never pushing for more than the person was willing to give. They understood that the power of these stories lay in their restraint. A witness who broke down completely might be pitted. A witness who spoke with quiet clarity made denial impossible. The translators carried an additional burden. They had to render the words without softening them and without adding their own horror. One young translator who had lost his own parents in the East found himself pausing more often than the others. He would take a breath, translate the next sentence, then take another breath. During one particularly long testimony, he stepped away from the microphone for a moment and another translator took his place. No one commented. The work continued. Later, in the evenings, the translators sometimes gathered in a small room near the courtroom and spoke of what they had heard. They did not speak of it as evidence. They spoke of it as stories that now belonged to all of them. The witnesses themselves carried the cost of their courage long after they left the box. The woman who had spoken of her son returned to her hotel room and sat by the window until the sun rose. She had not cried during her testimony. She cried then, quietly, for the first time in years. The man who had survived the mass shooting walked the streets of Nuremberg for hours after his testimony, trying to wear out the images that had returned. The resistance fighter who had read the letter from the child she saved wrote a new letter that night, this one to the court, thanking the judges for listening. She did not expect a reply. She simply needed to put the words on paper. The educational insight that emerged from these testimonies was not only that terrible things had happened. It was that terrible things had happened to specific people who had once had names, families, and futures. The documents and films had shown the machinery. The witnesses showed the human cost of that machinery. They made it impossible to speak of the victims as a category. They forced the courtroom to confront individual lives that had been taken or broken. That confrontation changed the nature of the trial. It was no longer only about what the defendants had done. It was about what had been done to real human beings whose stories could still be told by those who had lived to carry them forward. The courage of these witnesses was of a piece with the courage shown by soldiers who had walked into the camps and by resistors who had fought in forests and cities across Europe. They had all, in their different ways, refused to accept that some lives mattered less than others. They had all chosen, at personal cost, to stand against a system that treated human beings as cargo or as problems to be solved. If the stories of these witnesses who carried hell into court have moved you, and you want to honor the courage of those who fought tyranny in every form it took, there are ways to connect with that history and to see it brought to life. Amazon offers authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold pieces of that era, and the powerful film Midway on Prime Video captures the scale of the struggle and the bravery of those who stood against tyranny on every front. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the last witness of that day stepped down, the courtroom remained quiet for a long moment. The judges did not immediately call for the next piece of evidence. The prosecutors sat with their papers in front of them but did not turn the page. The defendants looked at one another or at the floor. The translators removed their headsets and rubbed their eyes. In the gallery, people who had come to observe because it was their job or because history demanded it sat with the weight of what they had heard. The woman who had spoken of her son walked out of the courtroom and into the afternoon light. She did not know yet whether her testimony had changed anything for the men in the dock. She knew only that she had done what she came to do. She had spoken the names. She had carried the hell she had survived into a place where it could no longer be hidden or explained away. That act, repeated by witness after witness, turned the trial from a proceeding about documents and orders into a reckoning with the human reality of what had been done. The men who had built the system that created that hell would now have to answer not only to the law but to the voices of those who had lived to tell what the law had once permitted. Those voices would not be silenced again. A former field marshal who had once signed orders sending entire villages to their deaths stood before the court and said that he had only followed the commands of his superiors, and in that single sentence the trial stopped being only about what had been done and became a question about whether any man could ever be excused from knowing the difference between right and wrong. Wilhelm Keitel had spent his life in uniform. He had risen through the ranks by being reliable, by never questioning the orders that came from above, by treating the chain of command as something sacred. When his lawyer asked him to explain the orders he had signed for the execution of hostages and the destruction of villages, Keitel answered in the steady voice of a soldier who still believed that duty was the highest virtue. He said he had sworn an oath to the head of state. He said that in wartime a soldier does not debate the wisdom of his orders. He said that if he had refused, another man would simply have taken his place and the orders would have been carried out anyway. His face remained composed as he spoke, but those who watched him closely noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he reached for the glass of water on the stand. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it revealed the private fear that lived beneath the public claim of obedience. The prosecutors did not let the claim stand unchallenged. They brought forward documents that showed Keitel had not merely passed along orders but had sometimes added his own suggestions for how they might be carried out more thoroughly. They showed reports in which he had requested harsher measures against civilians. They asked him whether he had ever considered that an order to shoot women and children might be something a man should refuse. Keitel answered that such thoughts were not for soldiers. The question, he said, belonged to politicians and to history. In the evenings, after court had adjourned, Keitel wrote letters to his wife in which he described the proceedings as unfair and political. He did not write about the faces of the witnesses who had described the villages that no longer existed because of the orders he had signed. He wrote instead about the need to defend the honor of the German officer corps. The letters were censored before they reached her, but even in their edited form they revealed a man who was trying to hold on to the belief that had guided his entire adult life. Other defendants chose different versions of the same defense. Some claimed they had known nothing of the worst crimes. Others said they had tried to moderate the orders they received. Albert Speer, the architect who had become Minister of Armaments, took a more measured approach. He admitted that he had known forced labor was being used on a massive scale. He said he had tried to improve conditions in the factories under his control. He did not claim total ignorance, but he did argue that he had operated within a system where refusal would have meant his own removal and replacement by someone more ruthless. In private conversations with his lawyer, he spoke of nights when he had lain awake wondering whether his technical achievements had prolonged the war and therefore prolonged the suffering. He did not say these things in open court. There he maintained the careful tone of a man who accepted limited responsibility while still insisting that he had never intended the full horror that had resulted. The prosecutors pressed him on whether a man in his position could truly claim he had not known about the camps. Speer answered that he had heard rumors but had chosen not to investigate because investigation would have made him complicit in a way he could not accept. It was an answer that revealed both honesty and a careful calculation of what the court might find forgivable. The defense lawyers themselves faced their own tests of conscience. Many of them had been chosen or approved by the defendants. Some believed sincerely in the arguments they presented. Others took the cases because they believed that even the worst accused deserved a defense. One German lawyer who had lost his own son in the war found himself representing a man whose orders had contributed to the death of countless other sons. In the evenings he sat in his small room near the courthouse and read the evidence that had been presented against his client. He wrote notes for the next day's arguments, but he also wrote letters to his wife in which he described the difficulty of separating his duty as a lawyer from his personal revulsion at what he was reading. He did not share these letters with his client. He kept them private, a small space where he could acknowledge the moral weight of the work without allowing it to interfere with the defense he had sworn to provide. The prosecutors, too, were forced to examine their own beliefs about responsibility. Robert Jackson and his team had come to Nuremberg convinced that the men in the dock must be held accountable not only for what they had done but for what they had allowed to be done in their names. When the defense raised the question of superior orders, the prosecutors answered with evidence that many of the defendants had not been passive recipients of commands. They had shaped policy. They had competed for favor by proposing harsher measures. They had used their positions to expand the reach of the system rather than to limit it. Yet even as they made these arguments, some of the prosecutors privately wondered whether the line between following orders and shaping them was always as clear as the law required it to be. They had seen, in the testimony of witnesses and in the documents, how ordinary men had been drawn into the machinery of death one small decision at a time. The question of where personal responsibility began and where it ended was not only a legal matter. It was a human one that touched every person in the courtroom. The tension in the room during these exchanges was not only between prosecution and defense. It was between the claim that obedience could excuse almost anything and the growing conviction, voiced by witnesses and by the evidence itself, that some orders should never be obeyed. A survivor who had testified earlier in the trial sat in the gallery one afternoon while a defendant described the chain of command that had led to the deaths of her family. She listened as the man explained that he had only carried out what his superiors required. When the session ended, she remained seated for a long time. A translator who had worked with her during her own testimony came and sat beside her. Neither spoke. The translator simply placed a hand on the woman's arm for a moment before standing and walking away. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything that could not be said in the formal language of the court. The educational insight that emerged from these arguments was not that the defense of superior orders was entirely without merit in ordinary circumstances. Soldiers in battle must often act without full knowledge of the larger plan. But the trial made clear that when the orders themselves violate fundamental human dignity, when they require the murder of civilians or the destruction of entire peoples, then the claim of obedience becomes not a shield but an indictment of the system that issued them. The defendants who invoked this defense most strongly were often the ones who had held the highest positions and therefore the greatest freedom to question or to refuse. Their insistence that they had no choice revealed the moral bankruptcy of a regime that had trained its servants to treat conscience as a form of disloyalty. In the cells beneath the courtroom, the defendants continued to live with the consequences of the arguments they had made. Some wrote letters to their families in which they tried to explain that they had done only what any loyal servant of the state would have done. Others remained silent on the subject, as if speaking of it even in private would force them to confront questions they preferred to leave unexamined. The guards who watched over them saw the same range of human responses that could be found in any group of men facing judgment. Some were defiant to the end. Some sought small comforts in conversation or in books. Some simply waited, their faces showing the exhaustion of men who had spent months listening to the record of their own decisions read back to them in a language they could no longer control. The rejection of the superior order's defense at Nuremberg did not mean that every soldier who had ever followed a command would now be held criminally responsible. It meant that when the command itself was criminal, when it required the commission of atrocities that any reasonable person would recognize as wrong, then the individual who carried it out could not hide behind the authority of the state. This principle would be tested in the years that followed, in other courts and other conflicts. It would be debated by philosophers and by soldiers and by ordinary citizens asked to choose between loyalty and conscience. But it began in that courtroom, in the long days when men who had once moved armies tried to explain why they had not moved to stop the orders that turned those armies into instruments of mass murder. The raw, unfiltered record of these confrontations, the faces of defendants when their claims of obedience were challenged by the evidence of their own initiative, the quiet moments of doubt that crossed even the most defiant expressions, the human cost of a system that rewarded the surrender of personal conscience. These are the kinds of images and testimonies preserved in archives that often cannot be shown without restriction on open platforms. If the struggle over responsibility and obedience has left you wanting to see more of the unsoftened realities that shaped the trial, there is a collection of raw photographs and footage from the era and the proceedings available through Gumroad's Unseen Media Archive that holds what could not be shared here. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the final arguments on this question had been heard, the courtroom returned to the presentation of evidence and the testimony of additional witnesses. The legal question of superior orders had been addressed, but the human question it raised lingered in the room long after the formal debate ended. Every person present, judge, prosecutor, defendant, witness, translator, guard, had been forced to consider where their own line would have been drawn if they had stood in the place of the men now on trial. Some had already faced versions of that question during the war. Others would face it in the years to come, in quieter moments when a choice between obedience and conscience presented itself in smaller but still significant ways. The trial did not provide easy answers. It provided instead a public record of what happens when a society teaches its members that loyalty to authority is the highest virtue and that questions of right and wrong are matters for others to decide. The men who had built that society now sat in the dock and discovered that the defense they had relied upon for so long could not protect them from the judgment of a world that had finally decided some orders must never be obeyed. That judgment would come in the verdict still to be rendered, but the question itself had already changed the way the world understood the relationship between the individual and the state. It had made clear that conscience is not a luxury to be set aside in difficult times. It is the last line of defense against the machinery of atrocity, and when it is surrendered too easily, the cost is measured not only in the suffering of the victims but in the moral ruin of those who once believed that following orders was enough. In the wooden dock where they had sat for months, the 22 men who had once held the power of life and death over millions now waited in silence as the judges prepared to speak the words that would decide their own fates, and in that silence every breath in the room seemed to carry the weight of all that had come before. The courtroom had been prepared with unusual care for this final day. The windows had been opened earlier to let in the autumn air, and someone had placed fresh water on the tables in front of the judges and the prosecutors. The defendants entered as they always did, but today their movements seemed slower, more deliberate, as if each step toward the dock might be the last they would take as free men. Hermann Göring adjusted his collar and glanced once at the gallery, where journalists and observers sat with notebooks open but pens still. He had spent the night before writing a final letter to his wife, a letter filled with instructions about their daughter and with the same mixture of defiance and self-justification that had marked his testimony. He had not slept well. None of them had. Albert Speer sat a few places away, his expression carefully composed. In the months since the evidence had been presented, he had continued to present himself as a man who accepted a measure of responsibility while still insisting that he had never intended the full scale of the horror. He had written letters to his family in which he tried to prepare them for whatever sentence might come. He had told his wife that he would accept whatever judgment the court delivered because he believed the trial itself had served a purpose larger than any single man's fate. Whether he truly believed this or whether it was part of a longer strategy to preserve some chance of rehabilitation was something only he knew. In the dock that morning he sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and waited. Rudolf Hess remained in his usual posture, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression he had worn through most of the proceedings. His lawyers had done their best to argue that he was unfit to stand trial, but the court had rejected that claim. Hess had written letters in his cell that revealed a mind still fixed on the past, still loyal to a leader who was now dead. He did not seem to understand that the words about to be spoken would determine whether he would ever leave this room as a free man again. The judges entered and took their places. The chief judge began to read the verdicts one by one, his voice steady and formal. For each defendant he summarized the charges that had been proven and the sentence that would follow. The room remained silent except for the sound of his voice and the occasional rustle of paper as someone shifted in their seat. When Göring's name was called, the sentence was death by hanging. He did not flinch. He had expected it. In the letter he had written the night before, he had already said goodbye to his family in the way a man says goodbye when he knows the end is near. Later that night, alone in his cell, he would take the cyanide capsule he had managed to keep hidden, choosing his own ending rather than the one the court had given him. But in this moment he sat upright and listened as the judge continued. Speer received 20 years in prison. He nodded slightly when the sentence was read, as if he had already calculated what the court would find acceptable. In the letters he would write from Spandau in the years to come he would describe the sentence as just, though he would also continue to shape the story of his own role in ways that distanced him from the worst of the crimes. The court had accepted enough of his defense to spare his life, but not enough to set him free. He would spend the next 2 decades in prison reflecting on the choices that had brought him there, and he would emerge with a reputation for remorse that would be debated for the rest of his life. Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. He showed no reaction. His lawyers had hoped for a finding of mental unfitness that might have led to a different outcome, but the court had found him competent to stand trial and responsible for his actions. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, becoming in time a symbol of a past that refused to disappear completely. Decades later he would take his own life in that same prison, but on this day he simply sat and listened as the next name was called. Other sentences followed in the same measured tone. Some defendants received death. Others received long prison terms. A few were acquitted. Each time a name was read and a sentence pronounced, the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. A prosecutor who had spent months preparing the case against one particular defendant closed his eyes for a moment when the death sentence was announced. He had believed the evidence justified the outcome, but he also understood that no sentence could bring back the lives that had been lost because of the orders this man had signed. In a letter he wrote to his wife later that week, he described the moment as both necessary and insufficient. Necessary because the world needed to see that even the most powerful men could be held accountable. Insufficient because the scale of the suffering could never be measured by any number of executions or years in prison. In the gallery, a survivor who had testified earlier in the trial sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had come to hear the verdicts because she had needed to see the men who had built the system that destroyed her family face some consequence. When the death sentences were read, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and emptiness. Relief because some measure of justice had been done. Emptiness because the people she had lost would still be gone tomorrow and the day after that. A translator sitting near her reached over and offered a handkerchief without being asked. The survivor took it and nodded her thanks. Neither woman spoke. The gesture was enough. The defendants who received prison sentences rather than death reacted in different ways. Some looked relieved. Others seemed almost disappointed, as if a death sentence would have been cleaner than decades of reflection in a cell. One man who had been given 15 years leaned forward and rested his forehead on the table in front of him for a long moment before sitting up again. A guard standing nearby stepped forward slightly, not to restrain him but simply to be closer in case he needed help. It was a small act of basic human decency in a room where so much had been taken away. The prosecutors who had worked so hard to bring this case to judgment sat together after the session ended. They had won most of what they had asked for, but none of them looked triumphant. One of them, a man who had lost friends during the war, said quietly that he hoped the verdicts would mean something to the children who would grow up without fathers because of the orders these men had given. Another answered that the real test would come in the years ahead, when the world had to decide whether the principles established here would be applied to others or set aside when it became inconvenient. They spoke for a while about the evidence and the arguments and the moments when the defendants had tried to explain away what could not be explained. Then they gathered their papers and left the courtroom. The work was done, but none of them felt that it was finished. In the cells beneath the courtroom, the men who had received death sentences were told what the court had decided. Some accepted the news with outward calm. Others asked to see their lawyers one more time. Göring, when informed, asked only for paper and pen so he could write a final statement. He spent the remaining hours composing a defense of his actions that he knew would never be read by the court. He had already decided that he would not give his enemies the satisfaction of watching him hang. The cyanide he had kept hidden would ensure that his ending remained his own choice. The educational weight of these verdicts was not measured only in the number of men sentenced to death or prison. It was measured in the principle that had been affirmed, that individuals could be held responsible for crimes committed in the name of the state, and that no claim of superior orders or national necessity could excuse the deliberate destruction of human life on such a scale. The court had not pretended that legal punishment could restore what had been lost. It had acknowledged, through the sentences it delivered, that some losses could never be repaired. The acquittals of a few defendants had shown that the court was willing to distinguish between degrees of responsibility rather than simply condemning everyone who had held a position of power. The death sentences had shown that the highest levels of authority carried the highest levels of accountability. The prison terms had shown that even when death was not imposed, the demand for justice required consequences that would last for years. The families of the defendants received the news through letters and through the newspapers that carried the verdicts around the world. Some wives wrote back to their husbands with words of support and promises to wait. Others wrote with a quieter kind of sorrow, acknowledging that the man they had married had become someone they no longer fully recognized. The children of the defendants would grow up with the knowledge that their fathers had been judged by the world for crimes that had once been presented to them as necessary for the nation's survival. Some would reject that legacy entirely. Others would spend years trying to understand how the fathers they remembered could have been part of such a system. The survivors who had testified and those who had simply lived through the years of persecution carried the verdicts with them in different ways. Some felt that a measure of justice had been achieved and that they could now begin to rebuild their lives without the constant presence of the men who had destroyed so much. Others felt that no sentence could ever be enough, that the pain they carried would remain regardless of what happened in that courtroom. A woman who had lost her entire family wrote a letter to one of the prosecutors thanking him for the work he had done. She said that hearing the verdicts had not brought her family back but had given her a small measure of peace because the world had finally said out loud that what had been done was wrong. She did not expect a reply. She simply needed to put the words on paper. The gavel that fell that day marked the end of the trial but not the end of the questions it had raised. The verdicts affirmed that law could reach into the highest offices of a state and hold individuals responsible for what they had done in the name of that state. They also revealed the limits of what law could achieve. The men who had been sentenced would either die or spend years in prison, but the millions who had been murdered would not return. The families who had been destroyed would not be made whole. The trust that had been broken between neighbors would take generations to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. The trial had done what it could do. It had created a public record of what had happened and who had been responsible. It had established principles that would be tested in other courts and other conflicts in the years to come. It had shown that even after the worst crimes, some form of justice remained possible. The story of how these verdicts were reached and what they meant to the people who lived through them is one of the most important chapters in the long effort to build a world where such crimes would be harder to commit and harder to ignore. Keeping the memory of these human struggles alive, the defendants who faced judgment, the prosecutors who sought accountability, the survivors who carried their losses into the courtroom, and the quiet acts of decency that persisted even in that place of reckoning, requires time, care, and the kind of dedicated research that turns a distant event into a living lesson. If these accounts of the final day in court have moved you and you want to help sustain this kind of storytelling so these lessons are never lost, you can leave a small tip of even $1 on Ko-Fi to support the work. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. When the session ended and the defendants were led away, the courtroom emptied slowly. Some people lingered, as if reluctant to leave the place where so much had been decided. Others walked out into the afternoon light and stood for a moment on the steps of the palace, looking at the city that was still rebuilding around them. The verdicts had been spoken. The sentences had been given. The gavel had fallen. What remained was the long work of living with what had been done and what had been decided, and of trying to ensure that the lessons carved out of so much suffering would not be forgotten when the next generation faced its own tests of conscience and courage. The echo of that gavel would travel far beyond the walls of that single room. It would reach into future courtrooms and future conflicts and future moments when ordinary people would have to decide whether to obey or to question, whether to look away or to speak. That echo began in the silence that followed the final sentence, in the quiet space where justice had been attempted and where the limits of what justice could achieve had been acknowledged with the same honesty that had marked the entire trial. In the cold gymnasium of a prison that had once been part of a palace of justice, the men who had been sentenced to death walked their final steps toward the gallows, and in those last moments the abstract idea of accountability became the concrete sound of boots on stone and the quiet voices of chaplains offering words that could no longer change what was about to happen. Hermann Göring did not walk those steps. In the hours before the executions were to begin, he was found dead in his cell. He had taken the cyanide capsule he had managed to keep hidden through months of captivity, choosing his own ending rather than the one the court had ordered. Some saw his suicide as a final act of defiance, a way to deny his enemies the satisfaction of watching him hang. Others saw it as the last selfish choice of a man who had never truly accepted responsibility for the suffering he had helped create. His body was discovered by the guards who had been assigned to watch him. One of them, a young American soldier who had spent the war far from the worst of the fighting, stood in the doorway of the cell and felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because the man who had once seemed so powerful now lay still and ordinary. Unease because even in death Göring had managed to control the narrative of his own ending. The soldier wrote a short letter to his mother that night, describing the discovery without details. He said only that one of the prisoners had died and that the rest of the executions would proceed as scheduled. He did not mention the way Göring's face had looked in death, or the small photograph of his daughter that had been found among his belongings. The other men who had been sentenced to death were led from their cells one by one. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister who had once negotiated alliances and declarations of war, walked with the stiff posture of a man who still believed in the importance of appearances. He had written a final letter to his wife in which he expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused his family but offered no apology for the larger consequences of his decisions. When the hood was placed over his head and the trapdoor opened beneath him, he made no sound. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who had signed so many of the orders that sent soldiers and civilians to their deaths, stood at attention until the last moment. He had spent his final hours writing a statement in which he accepted responsibility for the actions of the army under his command. Whether this acceptance was genuine or simply the last duty of a soldier who could not imagine dying without obeying an order was something only he knew. The drop that ended his life was quick and clean. The man who had once moved divisions across maps now hung still in the gymnasium that had been converted into an execution chamber. Other executions followed in the same measured way. Some of the men spoke final words. Some remained silent. A chaplain moved among them, offering prayers in a voice that remained steady even when his hands trembled. The soldiers assigned to carry out the sentences performed their duty with professional detachment, but later, in the quiet hours after the work was done, some of them would sit alone with cigarettes and try to make sense of what they had witnessed. One of them, a man who had grown up on a farm and had never imagined he would one day be asked to hang another human being, wrote in his journal that night that the faces of the condemned would stay with him longer than he wanted. He described the way one man had looked at him before the hood was placed, not with anger or fear but with a kind of exhausted acceptance, as if the long argument of the trial had finally ended and there was nothing left to say. The executions were meant to provide a sense of closure, a final chapter in the story of the men who had led the Nazi regime. In some ways they succeeded. The world saw that even the most powerful could be held accountable. Photographs of the bodies were released as proof that the sentences had been carried out. Yet the closure was incomplete. The men who died that night had been part of a much larger system. Their deaths did not bring back the millions who had been murdered. They did not heal the families that had been destroyed. They did not erase the knowledge that ordinary people had participated in the machinery of death at every level. The gallows spoke of justice, but they also spoke of its limits. In the months and years that followed, the work of justice continued in other courtrooms. The subsequent Nuremberg trials addressed not only the highest leaders but the doctors who had conducted medical experiments on prisoners, the judges who had twisted the law to serve the regime, the industrialists who had profited from forced labor, and the administrators who had organized the logistics of mass murder. These trials did not receive the same international attention as the first, but they revealed the depth of complicity that had made the larger crimes possible. A doctor who had once sworn an oath to do no harm stood in a different dock and tried to explain why he had injected prisoners with diseases or performed surgeries without anesthesia. He spoke of scientific progress and of orders from above. The court listened to his explanations and then sentenced him to death, making clear that the claim of following orders could not excuse the deliberate violation of every principle of medical ethics. A judge who had sentenced people to death for listening to foreign radio broadcasts or for helping neighbors in hiding now faced his own judgment. He argued that he had only applied the laws that existed at the time. The prosecutors presented evidence that he had gone beyond the written law, adding his own harsh interpretations to please his superiors. He received a long prison sentence, and in the years that followed he would have time to reflect on the difference between applying the law and perverting it. His case, and others like it, showed that justice could reach into the everyday institutions of a society. It was not only the men who gave the grand orders who bore responsibility. It was also the men who carried those orders out in offices and courtrooms and laboratories, the men who signed the forms and wrote the reports and conducted the experiments that made the larger system function. The human stories that emerged from these later trials were often quieter than the dramatic confrontations of the first. A nurse who had worked in one of the camps testified about the small acts of cruelty she had witnessed and sometimes participated in because she had been afraid to refuse. She spoke of the way she had learned to look away when prisoners were beaten, of the nights she had cried in her room and told herself that she was only doing what was necessary to survive. Her testimony did not lead to a death sentence for anyone, but it added another layer to the understanding of how ordinary people could become part of extraordinary evil. A factory manager who had used forced labor to increase production described the calculations he had made about how many workers would die and how many could be replaced. He had kept careful records. He had treated the prisoners as resources rather than as human beings. The court sentenced him to prison, and in doing so it sent a message that economic ambition could not excuse the exploitation of human suffering. The long road of continuing justice was not a straight path. Some of the later defendants received lighter sentences than many thought they deserved. Some cases were dropped because of political considerations or because the evidence was difficult to gather years after the events. The Cold War was beginning, and the priorities of the victorious powers were shifting. Yet the work continued because the principle established in the first trial had taken root. Individuals could be held responsible. The claim of following orders was not an absolute defense. The machinery of atrocity required people at every level to make choices, and those choices could be examined and judged. For the survivors who had lived through the camps and the killings, the executions and the subsequent trials brought a complicated mixture of emotions. Some felt that a measure of justice had been achieved and that they could now focus on rebuilding their lives. Others felt that no amount of punishment could ever balance the scale of what had been lost. A woman who had testified at the first trial received a letter from a friend who had survived the same camp. The friend wrote that she had read about the executions in the newspaper and had felt nothing at first. Then, later that night, she had cried for the first time in years. She did not know whether the tears were for the men who had died or for the people she had lost. She only knew that something had shifted inside her, as if the formal ending of the trials had allowed her to feel the grief she had kept locked away. The guards and staff who had carried out the executions carried their own burdens. One of the soldiers who had been present wrote years later that he had never spoken of that night to his family. He had told them only that he had done his duty. In private, he kept a small notebook in which he had recorded the names of the men who had been hanged and the time each execution had taken. He did not know why he kept the notebook. He only knew that throwing it away would have felt like pretending the night had never happened. The notebook remained in a drawer, a quiet record of the moment when abstract justice became physical reality. The executions and the trials that followed showed that justice, once begun, could not be neatly contained. The men who died on the gallows represented the highest level of responsibility. The doctors, judges, and administrators who faced later courts represented the middle and lower levels where the system had actually functioned. Together they demonstrated that a society built on cruelty required the participation of people at every rank. Removing only the leaders would not have been enough. The subsequent trials made that clear. They also made clear that the work of justice would never be complete. New cases would arise in other places and other times. New claims of obedience and necessity would be made. The principles established at Nuremberg would be tested again and again, and the world would have to decide whether to uphold them or to set them aside when they became inconvenient. The story of how the gallows spoke and how the road of justice continued beyond them is a story of both closure and continuation. It is a story of men who faced the consequences of their choices and of a legal system that tried to reach every layer of the machinery they had built. It is also a story of the limits of what any court can achieve. The executions brought an end to the lives of the men who had been sentenced, but they could not bring an end to the suffering those men had caused. The subsequent trials added more names to the record of accountability, but they could not fill the empty spaces left by the millions who had been murdered. What they could do, and what they did do, was insist that even after the worst crimes, the demand for justice remained. That demand did not end with the fall of the trapdoors or with the closing of the later courtrooms. It continued in the principles that had been established and in the memory of the people who had insisted that some orders must never be obeyed and that some crimes must never be excused. The deeper, unfiltered accounts of these executions and the subsequent trials, the private letters, the quiet reflections of those who carried out the sentences, the testimonies that revealed the everyday machinery of atrocity, live on in archives and personal records that cannot be fully shared on open platforms. If the story of the gallows and the long road that followed has stayed with you and you want to explore the legacy of these trials without restriction, our Patreon community offers uncensored video sections, exclusive podcast episodes, and deeper explorations for history lovers who refuse to let these lessons fade. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The men who died on the gallows and the men who faced judgment in the years that followed had once believed that their power placed them beyond accountability. The courts had shown them otherwise. The survivors who lived to see these outcomes had once believed that no one would ever answer for what had been done to them. The trials had shown them that even imperfect justice could speak. The soldiers and staff who carried out the executions had once believed that their duty ended with the completion of their orders. The weight they carried afterward showed that some duties extend beyond the moment of obedience. In the cold gymnasium and in the courtrooms that followed, the long argument between power and responsibility reached a new chapter. It did not end there. It never would. But a line had been drawn, and the world had been asked to decide on which side of that line it would stand. In the quiet offices where lawyers and diplomats gathered after the last gavel had fallen, men and women who had seen the worst of what humanity could do began to write words that would try to ensure it never happened again. And in those words, the ashes of Nuremberg slowly began to give birth to something that had never existed before. Raphael Lemkin had spent the war years in exile, carrying with him the knowledge that his family in Poland was being destroyed while the world looked on. He had lost 49 relatives to the camps and the killing squads. He had watched governments hesitate and argue over whether what was happening could even be named. In the months after the Nuremberg trials ended, he sat at a small desk in a borrowed apartment and worked on a single idea that had haunted him for years. He had coined the word genocide during the war, a term that combined the Greek word for race or tribe with the Latin word for killing. Now he wanted the world to make that word mean something in law. He wrote draft after draft of a convention that would define genocide as a crime under international law, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war. He sent letters to diplomats, to journalists, to anyone who might listen. He traveled from one capital to another, often paying his own way, sleeping in cheap rooms and eating whatever he could find. His health suffered. His friends worried that he was pushing himself too hard. But Lemkin could not stop. He had seen what happened when the world had no name for what was being done and no law to stop it. He was determined that the next generation would have both. In the United Nations building in New York, a different kind of work was taking shape. Eleanor Roosevelt had been asked to chair the committee that would draft a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She had lost her husband only a few years earlier. She had seen the photographs from the camps and had spoken with survivors who had come to the United States after the war. She understood that the old idea of sovereignty, that a nation could do whatever it wanted inside its own borders, had been shattered by what had happened in Europe. She believed that the world needed a clear statement of the rights that belonged to every human being simply because they were human. The committee met in rooms that still smelled of fresh paint and the dust of construction. Delegates from countries that had been enemies only months earlier sat across from one another and argued about the meaning of freedom, of equality, of dignity. Some wanted the declaration to be legally binding. Others insisted it could only be a statement of principles. Roosevelt listened more than she spoke. She had learned that the strongest arguments often came from the quietest voices. One evening, after a long day of debate, she sat alone in her hotel room and wrote a letter to a friend. She described the exhaustion of the work in the moments when it felt impossible to find common ground. Then she added a single sentence. She said that if they could not agree on the simple truth that every person deserved to live without fear of being taken from their home and killed because of who they were, then all the suffering of the war would have been for nothing. The stories of those who survived the camps and the killing fields shaped these efforts in ways that were not always visible in the official records. A woman who had testified at Nuremberg about the murder of her entire family wrote to Lemkin after reading about his work on the Genocide Convention. She told him that she had once believed that nothing could ever make the world safer for people like her. His persistence gave her a reason to hope that her children, if she ever had them, might grow up in a place where the law itself would stand between them and the kind of hatred that had destroyed her world. She did not know that Lemkin kept her letter in the same folder where he kept the drafts of the convention. He read it on the nights when the work felt too heavy and the opposition too strong. It reminded him that the words he was writing were not abstract. They were meant for people who had already paid the highest price for the absence of such laws. The negotiations for the Genocide Convention moved slowly through the United Nations. Some governments worried that the definition was too broad. Others feared that it might be used against them in future conflicts. Lemkin refused to compromise on the core idea that genocide was a crime that the entire international community had a duty to prevent and to punish. He worked with small groups of sympathetic diplomats, drafting and redrafting until the language was precise enough to satisfy the lawyers and strong enough to mean something in practice. In December 1948, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the General Assembly. It was the first human rights treaty of the United Nations. Lincoln stood in the back of the hall that day and wept. He had lost almost his entire family. He had spent years alone with this idea. Now the world had agreed that what had been done to them was not only a tragedy but a crime that could never again be treated as an internal matter for any single nation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights followed a similar path of compromise and persistence. Eleanor Roosevelt guided the committee through months of drafting sessions in which every word was examined and argued over. She insisted that the Declaration must speak to the dignity of the individual, not only to the rights of states. She drew on the lessons of Nuremberg, where the court had made clear that individuals could be held responsible for crimes against humanity even when they claimed to be acting under orders. The Declaration did not create new laws that governments could be forced to obey. It created a standard against which the behavior of governments could be measured. It said that every human being had the right to life, to liberty, to security of person. It said that no one should be subjected to torture or to cruel treatment. It said that everyone had the right to a fair trial. These were not new ideas. They had existed in the constitutions and the moral traditions of many countries for centuries. What was new was that the world had agreed, in the shadow of the camps and the killing fields, that these rights belonged to every person everywhere, regardless of nationality or race or religion. The human cost of this work was often hidden behind the formal language of treaties and declarations. Lincoln's health continued to decline. He died in 1959, largely forgotten by the public, though the convention he had fought for remained. Eleanor Roosevelt continued her work on human rights until her death in 1962. She traveled constantly, speaking in small towns and large cities, reminding people that the Declaration was not a finished document but a living promise that required constant attention. She kept a small notebook in which she recorded the stories people told her about what the Declaration meant to them. One entry described a conversation with a refugee who had survived the camps and who now lived in a new country. The man had said that the Declaration gave him the first real hope he had felt since the war ended. It told him that the world had learned something from what had been done to him and to millions of others. Roosevelt wrote that she carried that conversation with her for weeks afterward. It reminded her why the work mattered even when the politics were difficult and the compromises were painful. The principles established at Nuremberg and carried forward in these early human rights instruments did not prevent all future atrocities. Wars continued. Genocides occurred again in other places. Yet the framework created in those years after the trials gave the world tools that had not existed before. When mass killings began in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, the international community created a tribunal modeled on the one that had met in Nuremberg. When genocide unfolded in Rwanda, another tribunal was established. The International Criminal Court, created in 2002, built directly on the idea that individuals could be held accountable for the worst crimes, regardless of their official position. These institutions were imperfect. They moved slowly. They sometimes failed to act when action was most needed. But they existed because a group of people who had seen the consequences of inaction had refused to let the world return to the old idea that what happened inside a country's borders was no one else's concern. The educational power of this story lies not in the claim that Nuremberg solved the problem of human cruelty. It lies in the quieter truth that even after the worst crimes, even after the exhaustion of war and the temptation to look away, some people chose to build something new. They chose to write laws that said the destruction of a people because of who they were could never again be treated as a legitimate act of state. They chose to declare that every human being possessed rights that no government could take away without consequence. These choices did not come from abstract idealism. They came from the concrete experience of sitting in courtrooms and listening to witnesses describe what had been done to them. They came from reading documents that showed how ordinary bureaucratic decisions had led to mass murder. They came from the determination of people like Lincoln, who had lost almost everything and still believed that words on paper could make a difference if enough people insisted that they must. The hidden efforts behind these developments, the late-night drafting sessions, the quiet lobbying in hallways, the personal letters that kept visionaries going when governments hesitated, belong to the shadow history of the post-war world. If the story of how Nuremberg helped give birth to modern human rights has stayed with you, and you want to explore more of those concealed operations and the forgotten individuals who worked to turn horror into protection, you can sign up for our free email newsletter where you'll receive the ebook The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II, along with weekly deep dives into those hidden chapters. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The laws that emerged from the ashes of Nuremberg did not end cruelty or prevent all future suffering. They did something more modest and more important. They created a language and a set of institutions through which the world could say, with the force of law behind the words, that some things must never be done again. They gave survivors and their descendants a place to stand when they demanded accountability. They gave diplomats and activists a framework to use when they argued that the world had a responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. Most of all, they gave ordinary people a reason to believe that the lessons of the worst years of the 20th century did not have to be learned only in the moment of horror. They could be written down, agreed upon, and carried forward into the daily work of building a world where the next generation would not have to repeat the same terrible mistakes. That work is never finished. The laws remain, and the memory of why they were written remains with them. In that memory lies the quiet hope that humanity can still choose to learn from its darkest chapters rather than repeat them. The courtroom in Nuremberg is empty now, the wooden dock long since cleared and the gavel silent for decades, yet the questions it raised still walk beside every person who must decide, in their own small corner of the world, whether to look away when hatred begins to dress itself in the language of necessity and order. A woman who had once stood in that same courtroom as a witness returned decades later, no longer young, her hair silver and her steps slower. She walked through the restored halls of the Palace of Justice and stopped at the place where the witness box had once stood. She did not speak at first. She simply placed her hand on the polished wood and closed her eyes, remembering the faces of the children she had described, the sound of her own voice breaking as she spoke their names. A young guide, barely out of university, watched her from a respectful distance. When the woman finally turned, the guide asked gently if she needed anything. The woman shook her head. Then she said something the guide would repeat to visitors for years afterward. She said that the trial had not ended when the last sentence was read. It had only changed its address. It now lived in every classroom where a teacher chose to tell the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and every neighborhood where neighbors decided that the new family down the street would not be left alone when trouble came, in every moment when an ordinary person looked at another human being and refused to see a category instead of a face. She asked the guy to remember that. Then she walked out into the sunlight and did not look back. Her words carried the same quiet weight that had filled the courtroom when survivors had first spoken. The men who had once sat in the dock had tried to hide behind the claim that they were only following orders, that larger forces had made their choices for them. The witnesses had answered with the simple, devastating truth that every order is carried out by a person who still possesses a conscience. That truth did not die with the verdicts. It traveled forward in the lives of those who had testified and in the laws that grew from their courage. It traveled into the homes of the next generation, where children asked their parents why such things had been allowed to happen and what they would have done if they had been there. Some parents answered with stories of resistance they had kept hidden for years. Others answered with silence. The silence itself became part of the unfinished trial. A man who had grown up in the shadow of one of the defendants carried that silence for most of his life. His father had been among those sentenced. As a boy, he had been told only that his father had served his country and that the victors had rewritten history to make heroes into villains. As a young man, he had avoided the subject entirely, building a life that had nothing to do with the past. Then one evening, in a quiet cafe far from the city where the trial had taken place, he met a woman whose grandmother had survived one of the camps his father's orders had helped fill. They talked for hours. She did not accuse him. She simply told him stories her grandmother had shared about the small acts of kindness that had kept her alive when everything else had been taken. A guard who had once slipped her an extra piece of bread. A stranger who had whispered a name that helped her find a hidden child. When she finished, the man sat for a long time without speaking. Then he asked her what she thought he should do with the knowledge of who his father had been. She answered that the question was not what his father had done. The question was what he would choose to do now that he knew. He began, after that night, to speak openly about his family's history. He visited schools and told students that the men who had built the system of murder had not been monsters from another world. They had been ordinary in the ways that matter most. They had loved their children. They had worried about their careers. They had told themselves that someone else would stop the worst of it. The only thing that had made them different, he said, was that they had chosen not to look too closely at what their obedience was costing other human beings. He ended every talk with the same sentence. He said that the trial had shown that conscience is not a luxury for peaceful times. It is the last line of defense when the machinery of the state begins to treat some lives as less valuable than others. That same sentence has been spoken, in different words, by people facing different versions of the same choice in the years since. A teacher in a small town who refused to remove certain books from her classroom when officials demanded it. A nurse who spoke up when she saw patients being treated differently because of where they came from. A teenager who stood between a classmate and a group of others who had decided that classmate did not belong. None of these moments made headlines. None of them ended in courtrooms. Yet each of them carried forward the same principle that had been tested in Nuremberg. Each of them said, in the only language that ultimately matters, that some orders and some silences are too costly to accept. The educational weight of this unfinished trial is not found in any single verdict or any single law. It is found in the daily, unglamorous work of noticing when the language of necessity begins to excuse cruelty, when the definition of us grows smaller and the definition of them grows larger, when fear is offered as a reason to stop asking questions. The men who once sat in the dock had been offered those same excuses. They had been told that the survival of the nation required harsh measures. They had been told that questioning orders was a form of betrayal. They had been told that the people being harmed were not really people in the way that mattered. The trial did not invent the human capacity for those thoughts. It simply made visible what happens when those thoughts are allowed to guide the machinery of the state. The challenge it left behind is not to repeat the same crimes in the same uniforms. The challenge is to recognize the same patterns when they appear in new clothing, new slogans, new justifications that sound reasonable until the moment it becomes too late to stop what they have set in motion. There is no final verdict that can be delivered once and for all. The gavel that fell in Nuremberg could only judge the men who stood in that particular dock. It could not judge the generations who would follow. Those generations, including the one listening now, inherit both the warning and the tools. The warning is that ordinary people, given the right combination of fear, authority, and permission to look away, can build and maintain systems of cruelty. The tools are the records that were created, the laws that were written, and the stories that were carried forward by those who refused to let silence win. The records show how the machinery worked. The laws say that some things must never be done again, even when powerful voices claim they are necessary. The stories remind us that courage does not always look like heroism in a film. Sometimes it looks like a teacher keeping a book on the shelf. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor offering help when help is dangerous. Sometimes it looks like a person simply refusing to repeat a lie because repeating it has become easy. The courage shown by those who resisted tyranny in its many forms during the darkest years did not end when the war ended. It lives on in every generation that chooses to remember what happened when conscience was surrendered too easily. If these accounts of the unfinished trial have moved you and you want to connect more deeply with the stories of that global fight against darkness and the ordinary people who stood against it, there are ways to hold pieces of that history and to see it brought to life. Amazon offers authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you touch the era, and the powerful film Midway on Prime Video captures the scale of the struggle and the bravery of those who stood against tyranny on every front. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The trial that began in a ruined city with 22 men in a wooden dock has never truly closed. It continues every time someone chooses to see a human face instead of a category, every time someone refuses to let fear turn neighbors into enemies, every time someone decides that the story of what happened matters enough to be told again. The men who once believed they could hide behind orders discovered that the world would not allow it. The survivors who carried their stories into that courtroom discovered that speaking could still change something even after everything had been taken. The lawyers and judges who built new laws from the wreckage discovered that words on paper could become a shield if enough people insisted they must be taken seriously. None of those discoveries came with guarantees. They came with responsibilities. The responsibility to remember that the first step toward atrocity is almost always the moment when a person decides that this particular cruelty is someone else's problem. The responsibility to notice when the language of necessity begins to excuse the destruction of people who have been defined as less than fully human. The responsibility to act, in whatever small way is available, before the machinery grows too large to stop. That responsibility does not belong only to those who lived through the original trial. It belongs to every generation that inherits the record of what happened when that responsibility was ignored. The gavel fell. The sentences were spoken. The laws were written. The stories were carried forward. What remains is the daily, ordinary, and sometimes difficult work of making sure the unfinished trial does not end in silence. That work belongs to anyone willing to pick it up. It has always belonged to anyone willing to pick it up. And it will continue to belong to anyone who refuses to look away when the next test arrives. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The laws that emerged from the ashes of Nuremberg did not end cruelty or prevent all future suffering. They did something more modest and more important. They created a language and a set of institutions through which the world could say, with the force of law behind the words, that some things must never be done again. They gave survivors and their descendants a place to stand when they demanded accountability. They gave diplomats and activists a framework to use when they argued that the world had a responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. Most of all, they gave ordinary people a reason to believe that the lessons of the worst years of the 20th century did not have to be learned only in the moment of horror. They could be written down, agreed upon, and carried forward into the daily work of building a world where the next generation would not have to repeat the same terrible mistakes. That work is never finished. The laws remain, and the memory of why they were written remains with them. In that memory lies the quiet hope that humanity can still choose to learn from its darkest chapters rather than repeat them.